The video game history of Rugrats is an absolutely insane mess. Rugrats was a mega hit for Nickelodeon, so it's not really a surprise that there have been 15 games released to cash in on the show's success. But the show's premise isn't exactly an action-packed idea that naturally lends itself to gaming, so developers go to some pretty strange places. Over the course of their history, there were board games, fashion shows, weird Mario Party clones, and so many bizarre moments that have to be seen to be believed. To save you all the effort of experiencing them yourselves, today I'm going to play and rank all 15 Rugrats home console and handheld games so you don't have to. But first, if you're obsessed with video games based on cartoons and anime like me, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss a video. And leave a comment down below letting me know which Rugrats game was your favourite. And also let me know which thumbnail showed up for you on this video. YouTube is letting me A/B test multiple thumbnails now, so which one did you prefer? But enough of that, let's start our journey looking back at all 15 Rugrats games. Starting with the most recent game, which also happens to be an old school throwback. Rugrats Retro Throwback? Sure, why not? I think practically everybody was a little shocked when Rugrats Adventures in Gameland was announced. Firstly, a Rugrats game in 2024 just seems strange on its own. Sure, it's one of Nickelodeon's biggest ever hits, but Rugrats isn't exactly relevant right now. There was the 2021 reboot which ran for 2 seasons, but that show seems to be dead now. On March 28 of this year, the series was pulled from Paramount Plus before they could even premiere all of the episodes. 9 of the episodes ended up premiering on Nicktoons, I believe. Not 100% sure it's cancelled because I don't think there's ever been an actual official confirmation outside of the show just being removed from Paramount Plus, so I guess it could return on traditional TV. Either way, it's kinda weird to see this game pop up. It likely started development while things seemed to be going okay for the reboot, which makes some sense, but this game is really pulling from the OG series, not the reboot. For those unfamiliar, Rugrats Adventures in Gameland is a throwback 2D platformer calling back to the NES and Game Boy era of this genre. Retro throwbacks are constantly popping up in gaming, with beat-em-ups often being the popular choice. Doing a throwback 2D platformer was certainly a shocking decision, but a smart one I think, because this game received so much more press coverage than most other Nickelodeon games thanks to its unique nature. As you can see, the game has both a modern visual style and a retro 8-bit style you can switch between, instantly generating headlines. When you boot up Adventures in Gameland, you'll find 3 difficulty options, something most games from this era didn't have. You have Newborn, which is the easiest difficulty and allows you to respawn infinitely after dying. Baby, which has each of the playable babies acting as your lives, and then there's Big Kid, which locks you into a single baby. It's an interesting difficulty system, and I think it plays nicely into the fact that Rugrats has a roster of characters that players will want to see. Players can choose from Tommy, Chucky, Phil and Lil here, and each baby has their own stats for jump and lift. These only slightly tweak how each character plays, at least when it comes to Tommy, Phil and Lil. Chucky on the other hand has the best jump stat in the game, and you sure do notice it when he goes flying 1,000 feet into the air. I do think it's a little bit lame that Susie, Dill and Kimmy aren't here. Susie shows up as an NPC, but Dill and Kimmy aren't present at all as far as I'm aware, not even in the backgrounds of any levels or anything. Which goes back to my point about this being a weird game. Clearly the devs were making this game based on the earliest seasons of the show, which is why Dill and Kimmy are nowhere to be found. Angelica also isn't playable as she's the game's antagonist, although it would have been cool to have her as an unlockable character once the game was beaten or something. Outside of jumping, babies have a couple of abilities, a ground pound and picking up blocks, which can then be thrown as a weapon or stacked. The ground pound is something players will naturally stumble upon, but the block picking up is a little bit more obscure and creates a bit of frustration because the game never tells you or teaches you about this. You'll just kinda come to a part in a level where you can't progress anymore, and the game just expects you to figure it out. I'm sure some players will love this, because it really doesn't hold your hand, but to me, this is just poor game design. Nothing about the game guides you towards this ability. Instead, you're just asked to mash buttons, and maybe you'll eventually stumble upon it. Outside of stacking blocks, the gameplay is very basic, keeping in theme for the era of games developer Wallride is trying to emulate. You'll literally just be platforming from A to B, with the occasional block stacking going on. Maybe some rope climbing too if you're lucky.
I see you whining and grinding up on that pole.
When you start the game, you get some brief cutscenes, and I use that term very loosely. These actually look quite different depending on if you're in the modern or retro visual mode. You then find yourself in a level select map that is set around the Pickles house. You have 5 stages to choose from, with each level centered around the baby's imaginations running wild in a different part of the house. Inside each level, you'll have a couple of things to collect. First up, you'll find cookies, which restore your health and grant you an extra life. Then there are the Reptar coins, which are your ultimate goal. 3 of these are hidden throughout each level, with another coin given to you after defeating the level's boss. The goal of the game is to collect 21 of these coins, which then unlocks the final boss level. Rather than just gifting the Reptar coins to you along your path, each level has numerous branching paths and areas that the players need to seek out in order to grab enough coins. This can be a bit of a pain in the ass. There is definitely an optimal path to take in most levels, which allows you to seamlessly collect all 3 coins before then hitting the boss battle. However, most of the time you won't discover this on your first try, and instead you'll accidentally stumble into the boss battle with only 1 or 2 coins, forcing you to replay the level to grab what you missed. The game gives you 4 Reptar coins in the very basic tutorial level, so in the other 5 stages you basically need to collect 3 or more coins every single time. The real issue with the game inevitably requiring you to do some backtracking through levels comes down to one simple fact. This game is bad and the gameplay is not fun. In a way, they have really captured the quintessential Nickelodeon platformer experience from this era. Adventures in Gameland is just a slog from start to finish. Gameplay can only be described as tedious, just grabbing single blocks, placing them, walking back, grabbing another, and placing them again is not fun platformer gameplay. Traversing levels just isn't enjoyable either. There is so much awkward and even cheap enemy placement that throws off your momentum and becomes annoying to deal with. And on top of that, the game resets everything when you change screens. If you move on to the next screen but then have to go back for some reason, all of the enemies and everything you've set up will be reset, which can be insanely frustrating, especially when you accidentally change screens. This got particularly bad in some vertical sections where I was needing to move blocks around to progress. You can very easily change screens here on accident, resetting all of the enemies, and making all of the blocks you tediously moved around go back to square one. Some enemies just infinitely respawn too, which is something I always hate in a platformer. That one might be more of a personal gripe though, so I won't hold it too much against the game. So when you add in the fact that the core gameplay is a tedious chore, being required to replay levels because you didn't figure out the optimal path on your first go sucks so bad. Nothing about this game makes me want to replay levels multiple times. I guess one of the saving graces for this game is that the actual platforming controls decently. It was one of the rare areas for this game, at least when it comes to gameplay mechanics, that I didn't have a serious issue, so that's a win I guess. In a weird and kind of beautiful way, it's like the devs have accidentally replicated the retro Nickelodeon game experience perfectly. You've got weird jank going on, like when I had my boss battle with Thorg where I defeated the boss, but also took damage at the same time, creating this weird moment where Steve gave me the achievement for winning the boss battle. The game started to kind of show me winning, but then inevitably made me restart because I'd technically died. It definitely wasn't their intention, but this game perfectly captures the awful experiences I had when playing through Nick's early games, particularly the Ren and Stimpy era. It also manages to be faithful by only offering 90 minutes of content. So I slogged my way through each level, somehow managed to get all of the necessary coins to unlock the final level without dying of boredom in the process, which then took me to a final boss battle with Angelica. Now I do have to give Adventures in Gameland some credit. The boss battles aren't actually too bad for the most part. They're not great, but they're mostly passable, and the best thing is that they're all references to the show. Thorg from Toy Palace, Big Boy Pickles from Angelica's Worst Nightmare, the Dummy Bears who appeared in a few episodes, Mr. Tippy from Weaning Tommy, and Mr. Boppo from Give and Take are the boss characters here, which definitely gave me a nice hit of nostalgia. It's great that the devs clearly did their research and wanted to make this a game that appealed to old school Rugrats fans, even though this technically goes against this era of gaming. Licensed games from this era, particularly games that were developed very early in a show's life, usually made up the most random bosses because the show generally hadn't been around long enough for them to kind of establish and allow the developers to grab more iconic characters or moments to then turn into a boss battle. Unfortunately, I never got to the final boss battle with Angelica because the level you have to go through to get there is horrendous. It's kind of a perfect way to end this entire experience. The checkpointing here is god awful. The game makes you go through this frustrating platforming gauntlet that feels like a massive difficulty spike, which they then make even worse by all of a sudden offering the most unforgiving checkpointing, which up to this point the checkpointing had actually been quite good. At this point my interest in the game had dropped to zero, and I just decided to drop it for good. Where the game thrives the most is in its presentation. There's a modern looking widescreen mode, and also a Game Boy style screen that can be toggled via the right trigger. Square viewing mode actually shows more of the level vertically, which I found was actually really helpful and the best way of playing the game. In fact, the whole game sort of seems to be designed to be played in the retro style. When I turned on the 8-bit filter, it genuinely felt like the game became easier to play. Not sure whether this was in my head, but to me it feels like the game needs to be played in this mode. Not only is this art style superior, let's be honest, the modern visuals look kind of uninspired here, but it just feels like a game in this genre in general needs to be played with a retro art style. You also have a couple of other retro options to play around with, like a CRT filter and the ability to switch the soundtrack to 8-bit as well. The soundtrack is great no matter which version you select. I played the majority of the game with the modern sound, and it did a fantastic job of capturing the old school vibes, but then adding some modern spice to it. It really reminded me a lot of the Adventure Time game soundtracks. I'm super disappointed that Rugrats Adventures in Gameland is one of the worst modern Nickelodeon games I've played. In a time where licensed video games are at their most uncommon, Nickelodeon have been pumping these out compared to their competitors, and interestingly, a lot of these have been serviceable or downright good. To be fair, I haven't played that god-awful Avatar game that came out, so that might be helping with my perception of modern Nick games, but there's no helping the fact that Adventures in Gameland is a downright stinker compared to most of Nick's other modern releases. The only real redeeming qualities are the retro visual options and the soundtrack, as well as the effort the devs went to in order to appeal to Rugrats fans with references and overall making a very faithful game. But the game ends up being all style and no substance when the gameplay is so incredibly poor. To kickstart my tier list, I have Adventures in Gameland firmly planted in D tier. I don't know, maybe the people involved should have focused less on wacky marketing ideas, like creating an honest-to-god NES version of this game, and just instead made a game that didn't suck. I also can't be the only person who finds it hilarious that Rugrats actually never had a game on the NES, right? In my mind, Rugrats games are more closely linked to the PS1. Search for Reptar was actually the first ever Nick PS1 game, And for the retro style of platformer, the games are much more tied to the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. If you're still desperate to try this game out, I recommend only playing it on the easiest setting. That's probably the only way you're going to get some sort of enjoyment out of this. I'd also highly recommend using Chucky exclusively because his jump height removes some of the tedium from the gameplay. Ah well, with this retro throwback being a huge disappointment, we might as well take a proper trip down memory lane and check out some genuine retro Rugrats games. There were 14 of these released, some of which are a whole lot of fun, some that are terrible, and some that are so strange they have to be experienced firsthand to truly believe they exist. Now let's jump back to the very first Rugrats game. Rugrats Search for Reptar is pretty straightforward. When you boot it up, you have the option of main game, activities, and training, and when you jump into the main game, you find that your objective is to locate 12 pieces of Tommy's Reptar puzzle. The first thing you'll notice when booting the game up, especially if you were playing this in 1998 or have been going through Nickelodeon's catalogue chronologically, is just how good the production is here. The first thing you see is a recreation of the show's intro done in the game's engine. Sure, it looks kinda archaic these days, but it's still pretty cool to see and a massive leap in graphical power compared to what we've seen previously. It doesn't stop there though. Once you head into the opening cutscene, you're immediately greeted by original voice acting from the show's cast.
Either a lot of the puzzle pieces are missing, or it's the easiest puzzle ever.
The pieces must be all over the house.
It's okay, kids. Here, have a ball.
This is really the first time we've seen this executed in a serious way. Some of the previous 2D games had brief voice clips, even going as far as to promote them on the box, but these were minor and I'm pretty sure they were always just ripped from episodes of the show. And while we've seen many licensed games do this, many of them even to this day still skimp out on it, keeping the talking to a minimum. Instead, N-Space were able to get the voice actors to record so much dialogue. Yeah, there's the cutscenes, which there actually are quite a lot of here, but it's the smaller things that really stand out. When you're wandering around levels, the characters will spout various lines. Somehow, these never get repetitive. They obviously recorded a bunch of dialogue to ensure this didn't get annoying. Without a doubt, the biggest appeal of Search for Reptar in 2020 is the voice acting and humour. It's cliche, but it really feels like playing through episodes of the show. Visually, creating the Rugrats crew in 3D was always going to be a challenge. Being a Klasky Chupo show, the characters already looked all sorts of ugly, so bringing them into a completely different style is tricky. For the most part, I actually think the 3D works well for both the environments and characters. But there are some creepy looking characters. Stu in particular got the short end of the stick in my opinion. He just ends up looking like a crackhead. Search for Reptar is a great audio experience too. The soundtrack of the show has been perfectly replicated for the game, which is unsurprising since Mark Mothersbaugh, one of the major composers on the show, contributed to the game's development.
Popcorn! This place is stranger in friction.
The music here wouldn't sound out of place in the show, which really helps in making this an authentic, immersive experience. And then on top of that, there are some cool Easter eggs in this game. My favourite was a blueprint drawing of the Reptar wagon that plays an integral role in the Rugrats movie. That movie was actually unreleased at the time of the game coming out, so that's pretty cool to see. Many of the level names are taken from episode titles too. Things like that just go to show N-Space were really doing their homework and were passionate about making a Rugrats game for fans of the show. It gets taken to another level when you actually jump into the game. Your first gameplay sees you running around Tommy Pickle's house. Tommy's house acts as a hub world to enter the various levels. It's very similar to how Dexter's Laboratory Mandark's lab worked. However, the way Tommy's house has been brought to life here is far superior to Dexter's house and lab. That's pretty impressive considering Mandark's lab released 4 years after this game. It's not all sunshine and rainbows though, as you'll be spending a lot of your hub world time trying to get used to the game's movement. Early 3D era games, particularly ones that don't use an analog stick, can be super rough to control. Search for Reptar is no exception. Moving the babies around with the D-pad in a 3D environment is clunky, and while you do kind of get used to it, it's never perfect. This is one of the weird releases where the US version didn't have any support for the DualShock's analog sticks, but the European versions did. Not really sure why that was a thing that always happened. The clunky controls did lead me to realise that when a character runs into a wall, they act hurt, which was kind of funny. What was with developers including brutal damage animations for running into walls? The other major issue that a lot of 3D games had at the time is the camera. Either you had an extremely wonky camera that you're constantly fighting, or you had absolutely no control over it. Search for Reptar lands somewhere in the middle. At first I thought players had no control, but then discovered that R1 will center the camera behind the player, while the other shoulder buttons can pan the camera side to side and up and down. It's far from ideal, but just being able to center the camera behind the player helps a lot. Once you've had enough of sprinting full force throughout the house, it's time to jump into the actual levels. These are found scattered around the house, with various objects acting as the entry point. As far as I could tell, pretty much all of the levels could be accessed in whatever order you want. There is a little difficulty indicator under each level title, so there is a suggested order, but the game allows you to go wild and do whatever you want. The first level I took on was Chucky's Glasses. This is a very basic hide and seek / tag game where Chucky is tasked with finding the other babies, tagging them, and then racing them back to the playpen. After completing this, I was given a puzzle piece, which is what you're actually playing the game for. When you get these puzzle pieces, you actually have to put them in the correct slot, which would be kinda cool if it wasn't a 12-piece puzzle. Next up was the mysterious Mr. Friend. Here you have to fight the evil Mr. Friend as Tommy, which seemed ridiculously simple at first. I exploded him after 2 hits and was left shocked. Surely that wasn't it. Luckily, it wasn't. A bunch more Mr. Friends get created, making things slightly harder. In this second portion, the game tells you to attack them differently. At first they wanted you to throw cans, but now they want you to hug and kick them. Weirdly, even despite following their instructions, I couldn't seem to get this hug and kick attack to work. Instead, I just resorted to throwing cans again. But then, with one enemy left, the game wouldn't let me pick up cans anymore. Eventually, I just got the kick attack to work by holding down triangle, which wasn't even remotely what the game told me to do. The major thing I took away from this level was that the way they chase after you is actually kinda creepy. Seeing them climb up these platforms and stuff was kinda unsettling. After earning another puzzle piece, I was informed that I had unlocked a bonus level. Don't ask me how these bonus levels are unlocked because I have no freaking clue. To me, it seems like these bonus levels were an actual compulsory part of the game, and not some bonus you unlock through gameplay. The first bonus level I played didn't make a great impression either. This level tasks you with playing keepings off with a box of cookies, trying to eat them all before Angelica gets to you. The AI was stunningly bad here. I managed to maneuver Chucky in between Tommy and Angelica, blocking her path completely. The AI is so poor that instead of going around Chucky, Angelica is destined to just stand there and try to move in a straight line. This poor AI allowed me to just stand there and finish the cookies at a leisurely pace. After this, I found myself in the Ice Cream Mountain level, something I was quite familiar with. This is literally a mini golf game, something that is featured in the spiritual sequel Studio Tour, so I knew what to expect here. On each hole you need to make par or be under, but this shouldn't be an issue. I was knocking in hole-in-ones to the point where you would be calling me Tommy Woods. The controls are super simple and the holes never became very difficult. The biggest issue is how long it goes for. You play through 9 holes and it really starts to overstay its welcome by the end. This was followed up by a second bonus level called Mirrorland. Here Tommy's house has been turned upside down, with the floor becoming the ceiling and vice versa. It's an interesting idea, but the gameplay just involves you running around and collecting a billion balloons, quickly becoming a tedious task. Toy Palace gets the babies out of the house again, this time trapping Tommy and Chucky in a toy store after hours. In the first part of this level, Chucky needs to navigate a maze to reunite with Tommy, while the second part has you tediously finding and stacking boxes so you can activate a giant Reptar. Are you starting to notice a pattern here? There's a lot of tedious stuff going on in Search for Reptar. Next was 7 Voyages of Cynthia, which is probably the biggest change up in gameplay so far, apart from the mini-golf section. Here you play as Spike chasing after Cynthia, who has been washed into the sewer. This is a 3D platformer / maze section, where Spike needs to navigate the sewers, avoiding enemies, and disgusting piss and shit-filled water. Platforming with this game's controls is less than ideal. I'd wager if the movement was a lot tighter and the camera was a bit better, this section would have been a whole lot of fun. We then got another bonus level called Touchdown Tommy. I was so hyped thinking we were going to get some sort of Madden style minigame. Who wouldn't want to see Phil and Lil just fucking light up Chucky with a quarterback sack? Instead, it's literally just a cookie minigame again, where you're playing keepings off. If you had to resort to repeating minigames, maybe you should have just had less bonus levels? Incident on Aisle 7 was up next and continued the platforming theme from the Spike level, albeit with you playing as Tommy. Here Grandpa has taken Tommy to the store and your goal is to track down the Reptar cereal. Tommy will be jumping from platform to platform in his quest, and all it does is just prove that this game wasn't designed to be a platformer. In the second half of the level, you have to throw pies at Larry and Steve, the store's workers. This was a very weird change-up that was over in a flash. Finally, you end up in a maze dodging lobsters before having to fight a boss lobster. Fight is a very loose term though. You just have to stun it for a second and then you run off to activate a switch. Are you getting sick of the mazes yet? I hope not, because next up is Grandpa's Teeth, where, you guessed it, you have to navigate a maze. Spike has taken Grandpa's teeth and bolted, so Tommy and Chucky try to track him down. This genuinely might be the hardest section of the game. Finding your way through this maze is genuinely confusing, and these damn geese are always trying to murder you. Once you somehow figure out the correct way through, you go through a brief section where you ride Spike and chase after Chucky, who has been stolen by one of these murderous geese. Finally, you get to exact your revenge, killing the goose via hockey puck. Man, this game really is a whirlwind of different gameplay styles. I then got another bonus level titled Gold Rush, which simply requires Phil or Lil to grab coins before the time limit runs out. After this, I was making my way to the next level in Tommy's house, where I picked up a Reptar bar. If you pick up 15 of these things that are scattered throughout the house and levels, you get a piece of the puzzle, meaning you don't actually have to beat the levels. When I picked up this Reptar bar, I was given the final piece of the puzzle, which resulted in me completing the objective without actually playing all of the levels here. All of a sudden, I was being shoved into a level where I played as Reptar destroying a city. This is supposed to be the finale of the game, but it sucks. It's literally just another maze. Yeah, you can destroy buildings and such, but there's no point to it. Nobody's attacking you, and causing destruction doesn't do anything. In the end, you just make your way to the end goal, and it's over. But not before the most bizarre ending I have ever seen, where Reptar performs a dance routine. This is funny initially because of the sheer absurdity and unexpectedness of it, but then it drags on for an uncomfortably long amount of time to the point where you're just over it by the end. The credits then roll and you're hit with an ominous "we did it for the children" message. Momentarily, I was worried I wouldn't get to play the other levels I missed out on, but thankfully, the game dropped me back into Tommy's house, allowing me to complete the other levels. The first stop on my journey to clean up all of the levels remaining was Let There Be Light. Tommy has issues with his nightlight, so you have to go to the fridge for some reason. As you navigate your way there, spooky shadow monsters will appear, and you need to shine your flashlight at them. Once you get there, you realise you can't open it, so you need to locate Spike. Again, this is ridiculously basic, although it's kinda cool to explore the house at night. I'm sure I would have found this spooky as a kid. Next, we had Visitors from Outer Space. This one kicks off with Grandpa screaming about fake news and conspiracies, so Rugrats were really ahead of the curve in 1998.
Now I can see if my paper is scooped for news again.
Come on, Pop, that's not news. Those tabloids make all that up.
They tell the truth. Your real news doesn't dare. See, right here. A whole family taken by aliens from outer space.
This one is all about aliens, with the kids being transported into space in their imaginations. It's up to Angelica to save the babies by going through a ship and zapping robots. Eventually the gravity is removed and you have to float your way through a little maze section. I'll give it points for being unique, but there are major control issues in the zero gravity section. At random points the game would jumble up the movement controls. For example, pressing left would make me go right. This definitely wasn't a deliberate part of the level, so it just left me extremely confused and frustrated. After this we got our final bonus level, which was again just the keepings off game. Come on guys, if you were out of ideas, just don't make extra levels. Next was Circus Angelicus, where Angelica is running a circus. There are 3 stages to this, each consisting of you having to perform one very basic action, like literally running around in circles as Spike. Phil and Lil attempt to jump the Springfield Gorge here, and then the final task is to launch Chucky into a pile of leaves. The controls for that last one completely suck, as do the instructions. On the whole, this is definitely one of the poorer levels. The last 2 levels I came across were both easy levels that are very straightforward. The cookie race is just a race between you and Angelica, which turned out to be a lot more challenging than it seemed. Then you have Egg Hunt, where you collect eggs while a very generous time limit ticks down. And then that's it. That's every level in Rugrats Search for Reptar. As you can see, the devs throw literally everything at the wall for the gameplay, hoping something would stick. Some of it works, but most of it doesn't. Thankfully, many of the sections that don't work are just tedious and basic, rather than being downright terrible. I think the problem extends from N-Space not really knowing what they wanted to do with the gameplay. How do you make a 3D game based on a bunch of babies? I think this is something they sort of figured out with Studio Tour, where they really played up the imagination side of Rugrats. Some of the best parts of this game are when we enter the imagination of the kids. The other major issue is the difficulty. Obviously, a game based on a show called Rugrats is going to be aimed at younger kids, but just a little more challenge would have been welcome. In its current form, playing Search for Reptar is only something you should do to experience the fan service and the enjoyment of exploring the most iconic location from the show. Seeing Tommy's house realised in 3D is genuinely great. As a short, roughly 2-hour experience, it's not a bad way to kill an afternoon if you're looking for a dose of Rugrats nostalgia. Just don't go into it expecting superb gameplay. Overall, Rugrats Search for Reptar is an okay game. The best parts here, and the only reason to play it in 2020, is the presentation. As far as a Rugrats experience goes, this can't be faulted too much. Plenty of voice acting and cutscenes, solid jokes, it's got everything a fan would want. It's the gameplay that really lets this down. It's too basic, boring, and far too easy. There are brief moments where the gameplay is fun, but it's so simple that I can't even imagine small children would have too much trouble with it. Search for Reptar is definitely a solid game, especially for the first ever Rugrats game and the first Nick game on the PS1. It's a solid C tier in my opinion. Rugrats' first ever game may have been a flashier 3D title, but the Rugrats movie for Game Boy and Game Boy Color is the type of game that Adventures in Gameland is throwing it back to. There were 4 of these released across the late 90s and early 2000s, all of which followed a pretty similar formula. From my research, the only major difference between the two versions is that the GBC version is in full colour. Naturally, I chose to play that version for the review. Surprisingly, the game has a difficulty select option buried in the options menu. The game comes set on easy by default, so if you're older and deciding to check this out, you might want to swing by and change it. Your job in 90% of levels is to collect a certain amount of objects and then reach the end goal. Ren and Stimpy Time Warp PTSD flashbacks immediately hit me. This game isn't making a good first impression. It's basically combining all of the elements of previous games that have driven me nuts. Controls couldn't be more basic here. B makes the character jump, that's it. You can move the camera up and down with the D-pad, which was quite nice, but other than that, there's nothing else to say about the controls. So I started playing the Rugrats movie and I was immediately confused. The game explicitly told me that I needed to collect a certain amount of items to progress, but collecting items didn't seem to do anything. I was grabbing every item I could in this first level, but it was only increasing my score counter rather than the items counter. Getting hit by enemies would cause me to spill some of my items, but the score stayed the same and again, the item counter was static. Eventually I got to the end goal and successfully completed the level without my item counter ever moving. It was in the next level that this mystery started to unravel. Without initially realising it, this level started with the item counter being on 18. As I collected items throughout the level, this decreased, with the objective being to have it hit 0 before reaching the goal. Most of the levels from here on out have the item collection requirement, but there are still random exceptions at times. It's just weird. As I showed before, getting hit will spill your items. If you have no items collected or you fall from a height, you'll suffer a death. However, in many levels, taking that initial hit is as good as death. You lose all of your items, and unless it happens early on, there's a good chance you physically won't be able to collect the required number of items again. The game's fall damage is super frustrating too. It's extremely inconsistent about what height will instantly kill you, and the platforming can be kinda touchy, resulting in some annoying falls. Additionally, while the limited camera controls are handy, being unable to move it left or right means you're still taking leaps of faith every now and then, which inevitably leads to deaths. Despite far more resistance than I expected, I made it out of Tommy's house, and you're taken to the part of the film where the kids jump into the Reptar wagon. The game briefly becomes an on-rails driving section. It's probably best described as a shmup, but without any shooting whatsoever. There are a couple of levels like this in the game, and they're more miss than hit. You're required to get through these sections unscathed, as a single hit will kill you and you're forced to start all over again. The levels are pretty short, so this design isn't necessarily a bad thing, but because of some very shoddy hit detection, it becomes a mini nightmare. I swear to God, the hit detection is so unfair. There are times where I genuinely don't come into contact with an object, but it still results in my death. It takes what could be a fun change of pace for the game and transforms it into an annoying routine of trying to discover how close you're allowed to get to an object before the game fucks you over. These are at most a brief pit stop during the game. The standard 2D platforming gameplay is what you'll be fighting through most of the time. One of the biggest issues with these 2D platforming levels is that the babies are completely powerless against enemies. I randomly discovered that jumping on a bird's head will kill them.
Everybody hates birds, right?
But it'll also damage you, so there's no real point to it. Aside from that, the babies can't attack. I get the idea behind the design choice, but I'll be damned if having just a basic attack wouldn't have made a lot of levels far less tedious to get through. Without an attack, the game is entirely focused on your platforming, and thankfully the controls aren't too bad. They feel a little stiff at the start, but I think once you get used to how they control, it's not too bad. By the end I felt comfortable and had adapted to the game, allowing me to make jumps with confidence. There is a bit of a learning curve though, which might be a slight problem considering the game is only 2 hours long. Purely as a game, the Rugrats movie is average. It's certainly better than a lot of the other Nickelodeon 2D platformers we've played so far, but it's certainly not a standout in the genre. I think where the game is at its poorest, aside from the lack of clear explanations early on, is how it adapts the movie into game form. It almost never feels like I'm playing through the story of the film, and rather I'm just playing a generic Rugrats platformer based on a random premise the developers came up with. You start off being told Tommy is trying to escape the house, before driving the Reptar wagon away. I guess that kind of follows the film. But then the kids end up in the hospital with Tommy, Phil, Lil and Chucky all getting separate, extremely bizarre levels. These levels see you fighting genies, soaring through the sky, and exploring underwater. I know in the film the plan is to return Dill to the hospital, but they never actually go there. Instead, the devs included this extremely weird section. It sort of gets back on track after this as you end up in the forest, having to track down Dill and such, but it never truly captures the magic of playing through the story of the film. On the flip side, I think the game's presentation is pretty damn good. I think Game Boy Color games can be very hit or miss when it comes to visuals. There's just something about the color palettes that are generally used for these games that are a big turnoff for me. Fortunately, I didn't find that to be the case here. I think the Rugrats movie looks pretty great. The backgrounds and level environments are well done, and I was a big fan of the sprite art for the characters. The soundtrack gets a pass from me too. Replicating the iconic vibe of the Rugrats soundtrack via the Game Boy is a bit of a stretch, but I think they managed to do as perfect a job as possible within the constraints they had. It doesn't sound identical to the show the way Search for Reptar's soundtrack does, but they definitely get across that extremely specific Rugrats vibe. The Rugrats movie on Game Boy and Game Boy Color is a mixed bag. At times it can be extremely tedious to play through, and the fact that absolutely nothing is clearly explained to you throughout the opening few levels can be a massive turnoff. Once you get settled in, you've got a passable 2D platformer. It's not Nintendo level, but it's adequate. But just like Search for Reptar, it nails the overall presentation when it comes to visuals and audio. Arguably the only major misstep is that it doesn't really feel like a recreation of the movie a lot of the time. I don't hate what we got here, but I would have loved to have seen a 3D console version that tries to be a more faithful adaptation of the Rugrats movie. Overall though, I'd recommend this over nearly every other 2D platformer we've played so far in Nickelodeon video game history. As far as I'm concerned, Rugrats are 2 from 2 here. The Rugrats movie is a surprisingly solid old school platformer, certainly better than Adventures in Gameland. B tier it is. I want to say Scavenger Hunt is the most unique Rugrats game, but that would probably be a lie considering the weird places this franchise goes. If you're going into this review almost completely blind, like I was, you might be surprised to learn that Rugrats Scavenger Hunt is a board game. However, don't be fooled into thinking we're in for a minigame filled romp like Mario Party or the GOAT Crash Bash. I'll touch on this more in a second. Players have 3 separate game boards to play on, each technically being a different game. You've got Angelica's Temple, Pirate Treasure Hunt, and Reptar Rally. Not exactly a whole lot of content, particularly for a game in this genre. Just like the title of the actual game, all of these game boards have different names for the European version. This seems very unnecessary. Scavenger Hunt wastes no time pushing you into setting up a game. Right away you'll be choosing what you want to play, with a couple of additional options that alter the gameplay. The first 2 games have an option to toggle hidden squares on or off. Absolutely no clue what this means, so I guess I'll leave it in the default position. Then, once you've chosen the specific board you want to play on, you can also determine the size of it with small, medium, and large options. Finally, you pick which baby you want out of Tommy, Chucky, Phil, and Lil, and then you're into the gameplay. I decided I'd play in the standard order the game presents the boards in, so first up for me was Angelica's Temple. As this was starting up, I got a brief explanation of the game. Here the babies need to collect all of the broken statue pieces before Angelica finds her piece. It's very brief and very vague, not really telling me much about what I'm actually doing here. I was also surprised to learn that this game was collaborative. Instead of trying to specifically win the game myself, I was working with 3 other AI players to beat Angelica. This caught me off guard at first, but now that I look back on it, it's kind of a cool idea in theory, and a pretty good way to change up standard board game gameplay. Once things actually started though, I was unbelievably confused. I never thought board games based on Rugrats could be so damn confusing. I took my first turn spinning the step counter wheel thing. I then found myself wandering around a game board that has a million different types of spaces for you to land on. The first space I landed on was a search space, which turned out to be the most important space you can land on. Landing on one of these allows you to search a number of objects in the room to try and find the highly sought after pieces. Sometimes you'll find the pieces, sometimes you'll find nothing, and other times you'll find items that can assist you on your quest, like the ability to search twice in one go. It makes a little more sense to me now, but at the time I was seriously stunned by this game. It seemed like there was so much happening and none of it was explained. Once I ended my turn and the other babies started going, it was like I had been plonked on another planet filled with aliens. Nothing was making sense to me. So Chucky, Phil and Lil have their turns and then Angelica gets her turn. Makes sense since we're actively playing against her. But then all of a sudden Grandpa Lou and Spike are playing too? Are they on Angelica's team? Are they evil? Should I actively be avoiding them? Like I said earlier, there's a million different spaces you can land on, which makes the game feel overwhelming at the start when you have no idea what they do. Going in blind, I was hoping for some cool Mario Party minigames, but there aren't any. This is straight up just a board game, aka the least interesting part of every Mario Party game ever made. Most of the spaces you land on will have something to do with 2 counters every character has, energy and cookies. What does the energy do? What do the cookies do? I had no idea. The game doesn't explain anything to you. Imagine if an actual physical board game did this. Like you crack open Monopoly for the first time in your life as a kid, and the only instructions are don't go bankrupt. It seems like a rules or tutorial section would be a pretty basic thing to include in a video game specifically about board games. About halfway through my first game, it started to sink in. This truly wasn't going to be the fun Mario Party clone I had hoped it would be. Even worse though is that the first board game just doesn't really have much going for it. The extent of the gameplay seemed to be rolling the dice, landing on a search square, and then crossing your fingers that you find another piece. There really isn't much strategy happening here. At its simplest, Monopoly really is just a game where you repeatedly move around in a loop, but all the buying and building creates strategy. You can kind of see real-time associates attempting to inject this strategy into Angelica's Temple, but it's completely missing the mark. The energy and cookies are clearly supposed to be these game-changing elements, but they're not even slightly interesting. After like 30 minutes, I was still struggling to figure out what these things even did. Running into Angelica would make you lose cookies, but that didn't seem to have much of an effect. In fact, characters hitting 0 on their cookie counter had no effect at all. A piece of random dialogue from Lil during the game implied that the cookies were used as currency to perform searches. If that was the case, then it seemed like some actual strategy had been injected and the cookies served a purpose. But then at one point I had 0 cookies and could still search, so clearly that was wrong? I'm so damn confused. Much later in my playthrough, I came to the conclusion that cookies literally just exist to be converted into more energy. The energy stuff made slightly more sense. Points are spent every time you do something, and hitting 0 on that sees Stu or DD come along and put that particular baby down for a nap. This takes you off the game board, and it essentially makes you miss an entire turn. While this might seem like a penalty, it isn't all that big of a deal. The game isn't fast paced enough for missing a single turn to really matter. In fact, deliberately draining your energy or landing on one of the squares to go to the crib is usually a smart idea. This nap completely refills your energy, generally being way more efficient than wasting turns landing on energy squares or cookie squares that don't fill the counter up as much. On top of that, after you free yourself from the crib, you get free reign to choose where on the board you want to re-enter. This is an extremely efficient way to maneuver yourself to where you need to be without taking a bunch of turns. In a way, the energy aspect does create some kind of strategy, just not even remotely in the way the developers intended. There was also the mystery square, where Dill appears out of nowhere in the Reptar wagon and just yeets the entire game board. Overall, as you can probably tell, I didn't enjoy this first game. However, I will give it maybe a slight compliment. I could see this being a bit of fun if you had a full team of 4 humans to play against Angelica. Working as a genuine team to take her down sounds like it would work so much better and would actually introduce strategy elements. With AI teammates, you're spending an eternity watching other people take their turns, just randomly moving around with no genuine purpose. It takes way too long to play through a single game on the medium board, even with 4 players trying to nab all the pieces. Also, my team lost the game, which feels all kinds of shitty considering you're just at the mercy of random luck when it comes to searching, and the random moves of your AI team. Well, let's move on to Pirate Treasure Hunt. Here we get the same kind of vague explanation of the game as we did with the first.
Hello, how are you? I am under the water.
As far as I could tell, this game was exactly the same as the first, but with the format changed slightly. Instead of collecting treasure as a team, it's every baby for themselves. The first baby to collect every piece of treasure wins. Once again, Grandpa and Spike return as randomly roaming characters, but now Susie Carmichael is alongside them too. Thankfully, in this board I got to see what all of those characters do. Running into Spike allows you to ride him, running into Grandpa Lou grants the player some cookies, and running into Susie allows the player to purchase a piece of treasure in exchange for said cookies. No idea whether Grandpa Lou and Spike have the exact same function in the previous game though. Outside of Susie's appearance, this is identical to Angelica's temple. Even this being non-team based doesn't change too much, because I was just running around solo despite technically being in a team. Although at some point a sort of mini-game randomly played out for one of the other characters, I was genuinely mind blown as this happened, and I'm still not exactly sure what was going on. I think this was the devs' attempt at offering some different ways of collecting the treasure pieces. Would have been nice to see some sort of explanation though, because I have no clue whether it was required to play this minigame and buy a treasure piece from Susie, or whether you could still just win via searching. If you could still win just by searching, there's no real reason to explore the game board. This is something the AI-controlled Chucky did here, literally walking around in a circle in this one small patch for what felt like the whole game. To win the game, you need to collect specific treasure pieces, which result in you coming across pieces you've already collected. I believe all of this searching stuff is RNG based, so you're basically at the mercy of random dice rolls while trying to find a needle in a haystack. The games last forever, and mercifully Chucky won this game after flawlessly executing the walk around in circles infinitely strategy. I think that was the strategy that Beth Harmon utilised throughout the hit Netflix series The Scavenger's Gambit. Ah yes, we see Beth Harmon here opening with the classic walk in circles Sicilian. This will really pay off in the endgame. Last, and quite possibly least, we come to Reptar Rally. I wasn't expecting much after the first 2 games, but I was brought back to life when, on the character select screen, each baby was given their own Reptar sonar. These character models are fucking horrifying. They are seriously hideous and disturbing. This is like the Rugrats equivalent of making your own self-insert fan OC Sonic the Hedgehog character. Once the excitement and pure terror of seeing these abominations wore off, the fact that Reptar Rally is yet again essentially the same board game set in. They continue the tradition of slightly tweaking the formula, but it barely matters. Here, instead of collecting like 5 items or whatever, you have to collect multiples of 3 different items. They also changed the board structure here slightly, with everybody moving around in a circle and landing on different gateways to unique places, where you again move around in circles. Weirdly, this level seems to take place in some sort of purgatory or limbo, or Yu-Gi-Oh! Shadow Realm. Makes sense, because seeing these Reptar babies is my idea of hell. The small tweaks to the format introduce some new mechanics, which would be welcome if the game explained anything. Instead, it just makes this game as confusing as when you first booted up Scavenger Hunt. Also, Reptar takes a turn in this game, but he's just running around in circles on his own little ring. None of the characters even interacted with him during my game, so I'm not sure what the point of him was. So after running around in circles for far too long, I finally succeeded in winning a game of Rugrats Scavenger Hunt, although I did come staggeringly close to choking it away. It's an understatement to say the gameplay was disappointing. It's actually probably an overstatement to call it gameplay. However, much of the joy of licensed games comes from the presentation side of things. The music, voice acting, recreation of iconic moments and locations. Search for Reptar did this almost perfectly, and as a result, it made up for its hit and miss gameplay. I have to say, Scavenger Hunt misses the mark with its presentation. Visually, the game is a big step down from Search for Reptar. The cutscenes are noticeably lower quality, and somehow Stu looks even more like a crackhead here. I don't think the graphics are too bad on the actual game board, but yeah, it's a bit jarring after kicking things off on the PS1. A weird visual aspect of the game is that the players who aren't currently having their turn are shrunk down into miniature versions on the board. These look horrifyingly bad in most situations. Phil and Lil are particularly awful in the second game.
Mum says it's my turn on the Xbox.
I did appreciate that they gave every character a unique outfit to match the visual theming of every board though. It's a nice touch that they really didn't have to include. Unfortunately, the disappointment doesn't just end with the visuals. I praised Search for Reptar for its dialogue, particularly the way the characters never seem to repeat themselves. Here, characters always repeat themselves. If I had to hear Lil say almost as good as Wormies one more time, I would have punted her into the sun.
Almost as good as Wormies.
Don't get me started on how many damn times I had to hear characters say the word cookies either.
Cookies, 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 cookies.
Some of the cutscene dialogue is baffling too. This line from Dee Dee in particular was the real show stealer.
According to Dr. Lipschitz, babies need plenty of sleep.
What a bloody revelation, Dee Dee! The real saving grace here is that Mark Mothersbaugh returned to contribute to the music, so the soundtrack is spot on yet again. It helps make the endless board games slightly less dull. The board games suck. Just purely judged as board games, what Real-Time Associates have come up with here is pure garbage. If this was a physical game you could buy and play, it would still be complete trash. The worst games to play in my video game history videos are the ones that are just plain boring. I love to gush over games that surprise me and manage to be really good, while on the flip side, the games that are a mess are fun to pick apart. The boring ones, on the other hand, just send me to sleep. It didn't take too long to experience everything Scavenger Hunt had to offer, but it somehow managed to feel like a lifetime. There is genuinely no reason to play this game. None. Nothing about it is good or slightly interesting. I'm pretty sure subjecting your child to this video game back in the 90s could result in Child Protective Services being called on you. No surprise here, Scavenger Hunt is F tier. And spoiler alert, this won't be the last F tier game we encounter. Just over a year later, N-Space followed up Search for Reptar with a sequel. The premise for Rugrats Studio Tour is just that. The Rugrats crew have been taken on a backstage tour of Gigantomungous Studios. God, I hope this tour isn't hosted by Jimmy Fallon like the last studio tour I went on.
Oh, hey there! You made it! Welcome to the Universal Studio Tour. I'm Jimmy Fallon. I'll be making sure that you get through this experience in one piece.
Because this is Rugrats, the babies decided to throw caution to the wind and run off from the grown-ups to have their own adventure. The whole premise here just naturally feels like a Rugrats episode. The babies getting lost on a backstage studio tour pretty much writes itself. So the kids sneak onto some of the sets, but are quickly discovered by security. Dill then proceeds to steal a set of keys and yeet them before locking himself behind the door that said keys open. To save Tommy's asshole brother, it's up to the babies to track down all of the keys. The opening cutscene, and all of the others throughout the game, are top notch just like Search for Reptar. The voice work and visuals are great, and are yet again a treat for fans of the show. How do we go about finding the keys though? By playing through various mini-games, of course. Studio Tour is split up into 5 different attractions, each of which has a different theme. Each of the game's worlds are kind of presented as a sort of attraction where you can pretend to star in a movie. However, this gets a little murky, because at times it genuinely feels like they're using these babies to shoot proper movies.
Well, get ready. You're going where no baby has gone before. Outside space! And I'm gonna be sent to the moon if I don't finish this scene.
I think this might be one of those times where it's supposed to be the baby's imaginations, but this guy who greets you every time you head into a newly themed world really muddies the water with his dialogue. Once you've chosen which movie set to head to, you're given free reign to run around and pick one of several minigames. As I usually do, I decided to just go in the order the game presents things in. So first up was Captain Cookies, which was Angelica's world. As you can see, it's pirate themed, which results in many of the minigames following the theme. My immediate reaction once getting control of the game was that movement feels super fluid. There wasn't necessarily anything wrong with the way Search for Reptar handled, but here it's just buttery smooth and makes for a very pleasant gameplay experience. And that movement was certainly needed, because the very first minigame I played was a foot race. Here you have to race against the other babies in what can only be described as Mario Kart on foot. It's complete with power-ups and speed boosts and everything. There's something kind of quaint about this take on kart racing. Unfortunately though, this is a super frustrating experience. Overtaking other players is a huge pain in the ass, and in general, these races are so static. Everybody just goes the same speed unless they go over one of the few boost pads or get the one item that gives you a very brief speed boost. Without either of those, you're just plodding along at identical paces, unless you somehow manage to run into the hazards that barely exist. It means that if you stuff up out of the gates, catching up to whoever's in first can be a nightmare. The AI seem to never make mistakes on their own accord, and you really don't have any useful offensive items to reel them back in. It's just a frustrating experience that isn't any fun, despite seeming cool on the surface. For my hard work, I want a key for the door Dill is locked behind. I need 8 of these to progress. You don't have to just plow through 8 minigames to achieve that though. Just like Search for Reptar, there's an alternative way of earning keys. You'll probably have noticed by now that there are these Reptar tokens dotted around levels. Collecting 50 of these grants you an extra key, making life a lot easier. Next up in Angelica's world was Tag. Yeah, it does what it says on the tin. Using the map from the foot race, it's your job to run around and tag all the babies before the time limit is up. This game gives you a mini-map for this, so it's unbelievably easy to complete. Not that it would have been too hard without it. So after that very brief pit stop, it was onto something familiar to Search for Reptar players. Mini-golf returns, but in a much larger way. Search for Reptar featured one 9-hole course, but Studio Tour ups the ante. Not only are courses much more complex, but you'll also be playing mini-golf again when you get to Susie's world. You're tasked with making par or being under for the whole course, whereas I believe Search for Reptar required you to just make par on each individual hole. This means you have the chance to stuff up on one hole, but make it up by being really good on the others. I actually quite enjoyed this little quirk. I messed up the first hole on Angelica's course, which made the rest of the 8 holes pretty tense as I tried to claw my way back. One thing that was a little frustrating was just how long this game goes for. 9 holes takes an eternity, especially compared to how fast all of the other mini games are here. Not to mention, if you lose, you have to start all over again. I would have just about considered rage quitting if that had have happened to me. Next up was Treasure Hunt. No prizes for guessing what the objective of this one is. Here you get placed in a location and you're tasked with finding 4 treasure chests, which contain keys, before unlocking a bigger treasure chest, all while dodging enemies and doing some light platforming. Some major frustrations really started to set in here, mostly stemming from the camera. If an enemy hits you, you'll lose a key, which is sent back to one of the chests you grabbed it from. Having to backtrack from an enemy hit is frustrating, but that's mostly because of how you end up taking damage. So many times I was blindsided by an enemy who was coming around a corner with no way for me to see them. This is mostly because you have absolutely no control over the camera. Well, that's technically not true. Like Search for Reptar, you've got some very minor movements from the shoulder buttons, and you can center the camera behind you once again. However, neither of these options are useful in this situation. Free control of the camera would allow you to avoid these situations, but without it, you're blind way too often, resulting in hits that result in this annoying backtracking. Making matters worse is that there are 3 levels to this minigame. This is actually a big problem with the overall game. Many of the minigames ask you to play through them for multiple levels, but they just don't have the kind of gameplay that is conducive to being enjoyable after you've played them more than once. Finally, we came to treasure collecting. Again, self-explanatory title. You'll just run around and collect coins before a timer runs out. You have ample time to grab absolutely everything, and there's a handful of rounds to play through just like the previous minigame. Bizarrely, analog stick controls wouldn't work here. I played literally every other part of Studio Tour exclusively with analog controls, but for some reason they wouldn't work here. So I completed Angelica's world, and so far it's all very basic stuff. Search for Reptar wasn't exactly complex, but this feels even simpler. I had 11 keys on me after Angelica's minigames, so I headed to the locked door. Once you plug all of the keys in it, it opens, but reveals a second door that has 25 locks. The real kicker is that only one of the locks will open the door. To make things even spicier, the lock that opens the door is randomly determined. This explains why you get given so many keys, and also makes it possible to do super quick speedruns of the game if you get extremely lucky. You can literally beat the game in 30 minutes if you're good enough. We're reviewing Studio Tour, not trying to perfect pro speedrun strats though, so I moved on to Susie's world, which is titled Lazy Saddles. Goldmine kickstarted things and is actually one of the levels most ingrained in my memory. The babies jump into minecarts here and are tasked with collecting a certain amount of gold bars and then returning to the start before time expires. Along the way, the disturbing Mr. Friend will be zipping around too, so you have the ability to zap him with your flashlight if you get into trouble. Racing against the time limit is actually a lot harder than I remembered it, especially so when it's your first time exploring one of the levels. If you don't have a good knowledge of the layout, you're probably going to waste a fair amount of time. Additionally, getting hit by enemies makes you lose gold, requiring you to go out and collect even more. Because of the way this works, you could actually end up in a situation where there aren't enough gold bars left to meet the requirement, which I'm not a fan of. You'll also get hit by Mr. Friend when blindly turning around corners way too much. You have absolutely no control over this, so you basically just have to hope nobody's coming, or use your flashlight every single time you turn. Either way, it's not ideal. Roundup was next on the agenda, which is literally just picking up animals and putting them in their respective areas. There is a time limit, but it might as well not even exist, seeing how simple this is and how much time they give you. The one positive is that the final round sees you herding sheep as Spike. It's still not very good, but at least it's a unique twist on the gameplay, which is what is desperately needed if they're going to make you do these minigames multiple times. Lastly, we were taken to Milk Squirt, which I feel dirty for saying in a review about a game for children. That's the kind of title you see up on one of those naughty sites. Turns out Milk Squirt is just a target shooter. They changed this up a little as you progress through, so it's not just minutes and minutes of you shooting at targets, but it's still insanely simple. It's certainly no Toy Story Midway Mania. You also end up doing the exact same thing in Chucky's world, so yeah, just like Search for Reptar, they were clearly strapped for minigame ideas. Just like that, we were halfway through the available worlds, and it was time to visit Chucky in Outside Space. Zero G's was my first minigame here, and quite possibly was the first game that I truly enjoyed. You're basically playing a side-scrolling platformer here, sort of reminiscent of the first Crash Bandicoot. This change of pace immediately made me sit up, and to surprise me even more, it actually plays rather well. The platforming handles well enough, and while it's basic and bare bones like everything else in Studio Tour, there is a lot of potential here. I would play the heck out of an entire Rugrats game that played like this. My knowledge of Rugrats game really ends with Studio Tour, so I'm crossing my fingers for something that's sort of similar in the near future. The final game in Chucky's world was Looney Lander, where the babies jump in spaceships and commit vehicular manslaughter by running down a bunch of aliens. If this looks a little familiar to you, it might be because in Dexter's Laboratory Manduck's lab there was a minigame with a very similar design and premise. Looney Lander manages to control a million times better, but the fun factor just isn't there. All you're doing is boringly driving around a level. Our final world is for both Phil and Lil, titled Diapers of Thunder. It's racing themed, which means every single level here is a kart race. This seems like an exciting prospect. Hell yeah, I want to see the very first time kart racing was included in a Nickelodeon game. Unfortunately, like when Manduck's Lab did the exact same thing, this kart racing is horrendous. The issue stems from the fact that, besides the babies being in karts, this is just the foot race minigame. Literally every issue present in that very first game is present in all of the races here. There's no sense of speed, items are still pretty useless, and catching up to other players is still impossibly hard if you fall behind. In my first race, I quite literally sat in second, trying desperately to catch up to first for like 5 straight laps, only to fall agonizingly short. I think the best representation of this mess is my lap times for the second time I did this first race. 6 out of the 8 laps I did were completed in 27 seconds. It just completely misses the point of what makes kart racing games fun. After I got my bearings, the final 2 races were so unbelievably dull. I just got out in front and then never saw another racer again because they couldn't possibly catch up unless I screwed up catastrophically. I got so bored here that I just started spamming the horn for fun. You can play some of the minigames in multiplayer, including these kart races, so maybe, and that's a very big maybe, it could be a little more fun with other humans. After finishing the final world, I found myself 2 keys short of the 25 key total. Technically, I didn't need that many, but knowing my luck, I was prepared to try every lock and have the last one be the one that opens the door. Thankfully, I wasn't that unlucky and managed to open the door successfully. The babies go charging after Dill, resulting in 3 more levels. We get an Angelica level straight up, where she's pretending to be Shirley Lock Holmes. Initially, you'll have to locate 4 keys before being taken to a small puzzle platforming section. Then, once that's done, it's time for Okie Dokie Jones. The gameplay here is similar to the 2D side-scrolling Chucky section, but far more fleshed out. Weirdly though, the movement speed is all messed up. It's genuinely like Tommy did a huge line of cocaine before it. I can't understand why the movement speed is so quick. You literally never run this quickly anywhere else in the game, so it just comes off as bizarre. It also makes the platforming a lot harder than it usually would be. It's not easy to adjust to a coked out Tommy Pickles. I also had some problems with collision detection, particularly when it came to these moving pillars. If you touch them the wrong way, you'll be flung straight up into the air and to your death. Overall, this section is pretty tough. If they didn't mess with the movement speed, I would have loved it though. I really hope the future of Rugrats console games are a combination of these past 2 levels. The minigame stuff has been kind of neat, but it's certainly run its course. Shirley Lock Holmes and Okie Dokie Jones being the themes of these levels also feels like a direct homage to the movie, which featured the babies pretending to be both of those characters. Adding to that movie homage feeling is the game's finale, which sees Tommy and the crew being chased by Reptar while riding away in the Reptar wagon. This section kind of plays out like one of the chase levels in Crash Bandicoot. You know, the ones where a giant ball or dinosaur is chasing him down? It's a surprisingly hard finale to what is mostly a pushover of a game. It gives you difficulty whiplash when you go from putting animals in their correct pen to this. Once you've conquered the game, you're given 2 bonuses. The first is an extra racetrack in Diapers of Thunder, which is hardly enticing, while the second is a big head mode cheat code. It's pretty clear to me that Rugrats Search for Reptar was designed for very young kids. It's no surprise I was basically obsessed with this game as a kid. It's almost entirely focused on making it accessible for those who are new to gaming. I just don't think it has the same staying power as Search for Reptar. In that game you had the benefit of it being set in an iconic location from the show, and it was quaint seeing the characters in 3D and having all of the voice actors present. By the time Studio Tour rolls around, it's not as novel anymore. It does do a lot of things right and has plenty of nice little quirks. One of my favourites was the death animations. When a baby fails a platforming segment, it'll cut to them falling on a stunt mat, followed by a quip from a director. This is just such a cool way to show that the player failed, but not have the babies literally be dead. Although there was one weird glitch where Susie fell onto Angelica during this animation. Oh god, Angelica's been crushed to death on set. We're going to have to delay the release of the film out of respect. Pretty crazy to see just how much Mandark's lab was inspired by this and Search for Reptar. Having revisited these two games now, it's clear that they set out to just make these games but with a Dexter skin. Not that I'm complaining. Presentation wise, it's a banger from N-Space again. Mark Mothersbaugh is back for the soundtrack and really gets to stretch his legs here with the different world themes. The whole of Chucky's outer space section is a vibe. Visually, it's a minor step up from Search for Reptar in terms of fidelity. The real leap is made when you talk about scope. Environments are so much bigger, which is a natural progression from what they built in Search for Reptar. This is what happens when you give a developer a chance to build upon their work. Far too often we see development rights ping-pong around to different studios, resulting in a bunch of companies laying down foundations, but never really getting to build something truly great. While I've been very critical of the game, I'm glad N-Space were given a second crack at Rugrats. I do like Rugrats Studio Tour, but I think a significant portion of that is tied up in my memories and nostalgia. Revisiting the minigames for the first time in years, they're honestly not the greatest, and in most cases, they're far too simple. However, as a game for young kids, it's hard to fault it. This was legitimately one of my favourite games as a kid, and compared to Search for Reptar, it feels like there's so much more going on here. I think whether you prefer this or Search for Reptar will really just come down to which one you played first. The formula has pretty much run its course by the end of either game's playtime, so booting up the second just feels a bit meh. A lot of this probably comes down to my personal bias, having played Studio Tour as a kid but not Search for Reptar. I've got Studio Tour in B tier, but I wouldn't argue against people swapping its place with Search for Reptar, or even having them both on the same tier. Much like the Search for Reptar to Studio Tour unofficial sequel, just under a year later, Time Travelers released as a spiritual sequel to the Rugrats movie. Just like Studio Tour was to Search for Reptar, Time Travelers is a spiritual sequel to the Rugrats movie game. Obviously, it's not continuing the story of that game or movie, but literally everything about Time Travelers is a follow-up to that title. The setup here is pretty bare bones. Apparently the babies have just stumbled across a time machine. Naturally, Dill has gone missing as a result, requiring the babies to go after him. Technically there's a story here, but it doesn't matter. It purely exists as a vehicle to allow Software Creations the liberty to send Rugrats characters to varied locations for every level of the game. Things manage to stay pretty fresh right throughout the game purely because of this design choice. Popping up in each new location is nice, and for the most part, we're seeing environments that are radically different from those featured in the Rugrats movie. The one exception to this is the Atlantis level. It bears such a resemblance to Chucky's underwater level from the previous game that you'd almost swear that they completely reused the level. There's obviously some heavy asset recycling going on here, which is an understandable practice, but they don't make this level feel different enough. I felt like I was just going through something I'd already played. So we've got new locations, but that's about it for what's new in Time Travelers. The gameplay and objectives for levels are identical. Your goal in every level is to collect a certain amount of items scattered throughout, before grabbing one mandatory item and then finding the exit. Sequels are always going to share a number of similarities with the games that came before it, but this is just too much. They haven't even tried to shake it up. Frustratingly, they're still just as vague when explaining the objectives to players. In just about every level you start, the short mission objective text almost never gives you the full picture. Almost always it just says, find this specific item and then get to the exit, neglecting to mention that you have to collect a bunch more items on the way. You might think this is obvious from the counter at the bottom of the screen, but we're talking about a handheld game made specifically for children. Being explicit and over the top with your explanations is a necessity. The game still has issues with getting the player stuck and unable to progress in a level 2. When you take damage, you lose one of the items you've collected. I'm not sure whether this was the case in the Rugrats movie, but here the items you lose are sent back to their original location, meaning you can backtrack and recover them if necessary, rather than being left short of the count at the exit. However, there are still cases where the devs have completely overlooked major issues. The one I encountered was in the Egypt level. At one point you drop down a pit which, as far as my research unearthed, you can't get back up. This means if you take a certain number of hits down here, you can actually become stuck. unable to complete your objectives. Seeing stuff like this is so damn frustrating. Time Travels would be a far more enjoyable game if they employed a typical damage system, rather than having you drop items every time you hit. Speaking of damage, to me it felt like platforming presented much more of a challenge here, which is not good. I don't hate the platforming controls, they were fine for what you were doing generally in the Rugrats movie, but they certainly haven't been fine-tuned for complex and pinpoint jumps. Whether it's having to weave between enemies or jumping onto platforms with the world's tiniest safe zone, Software Creations have clearly tried to up the ante in the platforming department. This would have been a fine change-up if they had adjusted the way it controls, but they haven't. It ends up making the game even more unenjoyable. One of the best examples of the platforming just being too wonky is in the fairy level. You're tasked with jumping onto these leaf platforms, which should be a super simple thing to do. Instead, the stilted jumping and movement makes just getting to the platforms an annoying task. Then there's a 90% chance you'll fall straight through the platform. There's no rhyme or reason to why the game would allow me to land or fall through. You've just got to jump and pray throughout the entire thing. Additionally, there's plenty of other jumps where it's so awkward to get to a higher platform. At times, it feels like it's not physically possible to make these jumps, even though the devs clearly have designed for you to go to these places. And can we talk about the meaningless decision to allow you to slide down slopes? It offers nothing in the game other than giving you a great way to take damage, as once you go into the animation you're stuck, and can't move until you're at the bottom. This action is engaged by pressing down on the D-pad, which also happens to be one of the ways you move the camera around. It's such a clunky combination. Returning from the Rugrats movie is my major annoyance at the babies being totally defenseless against enemies. The only way you avoid enemies is by jumping over them, or accidentally landing on them, which will damage you but also kill the enemy. Although the enemies will respawn as soon as you walk off screen, so that's ultimately pointless. It feels like they introduced way more enemies into levels for this follow-up, which makes the lack of an attack stand out considerably more. Would it really have killed them to include something like an attack where the kids throw balls? Search for Reptar and Studio Tour found ways to adapt weapons into these kids' games without issue. My rage towards the enemies really started peaking when they had enemies popping up out of the ground with no warning. I love to take damage from enemies I couldn't possibly react to and avoid. It's so much fun. Ultimately, it's hard to understand who the hell this game is made for. While many Nicktoons had massive appeal to older audiences, such as Ren and Stimpy, Rocko's Modern Life, and Doug, Rugrats is without a doubt more focused on younger audiences. That's not to say an older audience can't enjoy it, but it's clearly designed mostly with kids in mind. Naturally, you would imagine a Rugrats game has kids as the focus when designing the difficulty, but that's not the case here. This might as well be Mega Man as far as young kids are concerned. There's no possible way this is an enjoyable and accessible difficulty for them. Having played through a fair chunk of the game, I was starting to get really disappointed that no improvements had been made to the formula of the previous game. Apart from the new locations of levels, it was exactly the same game. But then just as I was thinking this, I was smacked in the face with something different. An on-rails shooter level. This was totally unexpected and got me excited again, until I discovered that, like everything else in the game, it's not fun to play. Controlling the shooting is just so unintuitive, and I found that it wasn't good enough to allow you to react as quickly as the game wanted you to. I was also extremely confused why cups of orange juice left on the ground were damaging me. To be fair to the game, there are some slight tweaks to the formula outside of this level too. By collecting special blocks that are tucked away in levels, you can be taken to bonus levels, which vary in gameplay. The one I unlocked was just a shitty claw machine minigame though, and it was pointless to play. The only thing you gain from it is more points for your score, which I can't say I ever once gave a shit about. The big finale of the game changes things a little too. First up, the driving levels return from Rugrats Movie, with the babies heading to space this time. I'll give them credit for seriously tweaking the hit detection and removing the one-hit kill aspect, but it's still not very fun to play, especially as your finale. Then the very final level you play through is an on-rails Dill section. Dill is in his little rolly gimmick, and all you have to do is press B occasionally to jump over things. It's dull and a very strange way to cap off the game. So yeah, when it comes to gameplay, it's pretty much the same thing as the Rugrats movie. Not much has changed, and the stuff they have changed has made the game even worse. The single aspect where Time Travelers is a massive step up is the visuals. Good lord, this has got to be one of the best looking Game Boy Color games I have ever seen. I've stated previously that I don't really love the visual style of Game Boy Color games, but Time Travelers really contradicts that. The sprite work is absolutely stunning. I'm not exaggerating when I say this might be my favourite looking game I have ever reviewed on this channel. From the research I've done into the games that are most commonly cited as being the best looking Game Boy Color games, I'd have to say Time Travelers really is in the upper echelon. The environments are fantastically detailed and cover a lot of different styles, the characters look spot on, and there's a surprising amount of life in all of the little animations. It's so jarring to go through the stilted and stale gameplay, all while looking at visuals that are literally setting the standards for what this console is capable of. It might not be fun to play, but damn, Time Travelers is some eye candy. Rugrats Time Travelers sucks. It's not as bad as some of the absolute dreck I played on the Super Nintendo, but it's still extraordinarily bad. Functioning as a sequel to the Rugrats movie, it brings nothing new to the table in terms of the gameplay. Sure, the graphics are superb, but that isn't enough when the gameplay is identical to the previous game. Just a little tweak here and there could have made this so much more fun to experience. It might not have made this a good game, but it has the potential to be so much more than what we got. If Time Travelers played as good as it looked, it would be one of the greatest 2D platformers in history. Time Travelers is a disappointing follow-up to the Rugrats movie, but not a total failure. D tier alongside Adventures in Gameland. When I mentioned that Rugrats games go to some pretty bizarre places, I really meant it.
Open! Open! Open!
One of the most unique aspects about Totally Angelica stems from the entire reason it exists. This game is a clear attempt from Nickelodeon to reach out and tap into the gamer girl market, as well as the overall female audience for the channel. Nickelodeon's shows have a broad demographic appeal, and none of the previous games were specifically gendered for boys or for girls, but it's clear here with the way the game is themed, and from it specifically starring Angelica, that they were experimenting with catering to girls specifically. Personally, I think they could have just sold Angelica Gamer Girl bathwater instead. Would have been much easier and much cheaper. Also, from watching gameplay before heading into this, it seems that the PS1 and Game Boy Color versions are almost identical, just with the PS1 version bringing that game into 3D. I played about 30 minutes of the handheld version and it pretty much confirmed this, so to avoid repeating myself, I'm just going to focus on the PS1 game. So the entire premise of Totally Angelica is about her using her imagination to hold a mall fashion show. Everything starts with her getting some sort of Cynthia playset. When she can't open it, she just repeatedly yeets it around the room in a genuinely hilarious cutscene.
Open! 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 There! Open!
Don't expect a slew of other cutscenes like this though. From my experience, this was the only one of its kind in the game, which is a little disappointing. Once this brief bit of setup is out of the way, you're dropped into a mall without much explanation. Eventually, you'll discover that you've landed in yet another minigame compilation. Seriously, every bloody Rugrats console game seems to be one of these. You access these minigames through different shop fronts, and when you successfully complete one, you're rewarded with an item of clothing. Initially, I thought this was a cool little cosmetic reward, allowing you to customize Angelica as you progress through the mall's minigames, but that's not the case. I also noticed that there was a points counter at the top with a target I needed to reach, but it wasn't changing when I completed minigames. Quickly, I started to put together what was happening. In Totally Angelica, you first compete in the minigames, winning various outfit pieces and accessories depending on what type of store it is. Then, once you've gathered up some items, you head to the fashion show where you need to dress up Angelica the best you can. You strut your stuff on the runway, a bunch of judgmental assholes give you a score out of 10, and then the points total of those scores makes your points counter go up. As you get the required points total, you gain access to the elevator, allowing you to head up to new floors and win new types of clothes. I have to admit, I'm slightly creeped out by the child beauty pageant aspect of this game. Those things have always sort of grossed me out, but I guess it's made slightly okay by this game actually taking place in Angelica's imagination. In my first fashion show, I got a whole ass 5 points. For reference, the target to move up a level was 25.
I was rooting for you! We were all rooting for you! How dare you! Learn something from this!
My first thought upon being booted from my first attempt on the runway was, I wonder if these points stack. Well, that was quickly cleared up as I entered my second show, grabbed 14 points, and then left with an overall total of 19. This seems kinda stupid to me. There's literally nothing stopping anybody from completing the entire game with the absolute worst outfits possible. Instead of overall points allowing you to progress up the floors, I think I would have preferred to see the target be an average score. Maybe the first floor requires you to have an average judge's score of 5 before progression. Another thing I'd overhaul is the fact that you don't really receive any feedback on your outfit. Sure, you can see what numbers the judges scored, but they don't give you any indicators for what's good or bad about your outfit. It ends up just being a game of trial and error, which is boring and a little tedious. Instead of grinding out the first floor minigames over and over again, hoping they'd give me some sort of killer accessory, I instead just brute forced my way to the second level, which was now asking me to get 125 points. New floors mean new minigames and new items to win for Angelica. Playing these minigames to win new stuff for Angelica isn't too bad when the minigames are new and fresh, but asking me to repeatedly play the same ones is just a big turnoff. In an ideal world, there would be dozens of minigames to play, and I actually wouldn't have had a problem with grinding to get the best fitting clothes. So once again, I brute forced my way to the next floor, and now I needed to get a bunch of points yet again. At this point, I was starting to sense a pattern. This game seemingly heavily ties your score to just putting as many accessories on Angelica as possible. There's actually a surprising number of different categories to fill in the fashion show portion, and I noticed that by just putting something on, regardless of whether it matched the outfit or not, would always drastically improve my score. All of my best scores seemed to come from just slapping everything I owned onto Angelica and pushing her out the door. It made me care significantly less for these sections. Why should I try and put effort into giving Angelica a dope outfit if it actually doesn't matter all that much in the judging? Might as well just send her out there with a yee ass haircut. The minigames just really don't have much staying power either. The overwhelming majority of them are super basic and a step down from what we've seen in Search for Reptar and Studio Tour. There are a few gems here though. The weird pinball maze game is kinda fun, and I got a kick out of the stealth game with Tommy, which is basically Metal Gear Solid for babies. But the shitty games vastly outweigh the good ones. In particular, I despise the pinata game. You're supposed to yell out directions to Tommy via the D-pad, but the game controls like he's not even listening to you. It was a super frustrating experience, even if I did smash the pinata in the end. It's stunning how quickly the minigames run out of steam. By the time you reach the 4th floor, they've resorted to just repeating minigames. I've said this in 2 separate videos, and I'll say it again. Don't force players to repeat your shitty minigames. The whole premise of Totally Angelica is just inherently flawed. To play the game properly, you're forced to repeat minigames over and over again until you get the perfect set of clothes and accessories. Not only is this repetition boring, but they run out of minigame ideas like halfway through the game. There was honestly no way this game was going to convince me to stomp up and down this mall replaying minigames to try and get the perfect outfit. Naturally, I committed myself to brute forcing my way to the very end. This plan was immediately punched in the fucking face when I progressed to the 5th floor and saw I had to grind 500 more tickets. No thank you, I'm done here. There's not a single new minigame on this floor, so I'm really not sure why the devs thought it was a good idea to include this section. It just doesn't need to exist because it adds literally nothing to the experience. We've got worse grinding here than in most JRPGs. In a perfect world where I had a magical outfit that could score perfect 10s, it still would have taken me 6 or 7 fashion shows to win enough points. Seriously, go fuck yourself, Totally Angelica. Visually, this game is kinda funky. It's got this weird hybrid of 2D and 3D going on, which I found kind of ugly. I think all of the character models are pretty solid, but a lot of the time when they're combined with the 2D elements, it just looks strange. It's hard not to be a little disappointed with the visuals and scope of Totally Angelica coming off the back of Studio Tour, which expanded on how big the levels were and definitely looked a lot prettier overall.
I'm going to be the mall fashion show queen.
There's a version of Totally Angelica that is a perfectly fine kids game. Unfortunately, this here isn't that version. The skeleton of a decent kids game is here, but the execution is incredibly poor, and I get the feeling that most kids who pick this up would have become bored by it quickly. Most of the issues stem from the repetition of minigames and the fact that the fashion show aspects are in dire need of a rework. It baffles me that Totally Angelica doesn't give the player any useful feedback on how to make their outfits better. When you combine that with the fact that it seems like just closing your eyes and putting one of each accessory on Angelica is the best strategy, well, it makes me question why anyone would bother playing this. Younger players could probably squeeze some enjoyment from Totally Angelica, but if you're older, there's really no hook for you, unlike basically all of the other Rugrats games I've reviewed so far. It's also extremely hard to tell who is to blame for this game's many flaws. From my short play session with the original GBC version, it seems like all of the issues I mentioned in my review are present there. It wouldn't surprise me if THQ, who were Totally Angelica's publisher, came to Artco and basically told them to directly port the game and don't waste time and money on changing or adding things. The end product is just so poor, and it's a bit of a shame that the one and only Nickelodeon game specifically designed for girls was so bad. From a quick glance, it doesn't seem like Nickelodeon did anything like this ever again. There is a little bit of fun to be found in Totally Angelica, which just saves it from F, and lands it squarely in D tier. The handheld version is mostly the same as the console version, so I imagine it would slot into D as well. Wait, who was in Paris? In Rugrats in Paris for the PS1 and Nintendo 64, you've got two options, Adventure Mode or a very vaguely described two-player mode. As soon as you jump into the Adventure Mode, you're greeted with something new, the ability to choose which baby you want to play as. Naturally, I chose Chucky, seeing as Rugrats in Paris is all about how this little sad sack wants a mum. Despite me wanting to live out my Rugrats in Paris roleplay fantasy, this game really isn't trying to adapt the movie into a game. Instead, you're just goofing around Reptar Land. This ain't your daddy's Reptar Land though. This is Euro Reptar Land, filled with baguettes and berets and one of them long cigarette things. And if it's anything like Disneyland Paris in real life, the launch of it was a complete mess that majorly affected the operations of the parent company. Without any prior knowledge of the game, the beginning here is so awkward. You're just plonked in the middle of the park with no real direction except for a short cutscene that doesn't exactly explain anything. So I just start running around and collecting these Reptar tickets that are scattered about. Strangely, going in and out of buildings here will make the tickets respawn exactly where they were, which seems a bit silly to me. Why try and earn tickets through the proper means when you can just repeatedly do this over and over again? These red Reptar tickets are used as currency to redeem various prizes. There you go, Chucky. No need to be sad about your dead mum anymore. I've given you the gift of Reptar basketball. That's way better than having a mum. The other form of tickets here are gold tickets, which are the really important thing throughout this game. Earning 16 gold tickets will allow you to buy this helmet thing, which is your ultimate goal. How do you win gold tickets? Well, I'll touch on that more in a second, but purchasing these items with red tickets generally leads you to gaining a gold ticket when used correctly. I've been playing for not even 5 minutes and hadn't experienced any gameplay, but I was already fed up with the way Rugrats in Paris controls. It's baffling to see the basic movement control in such a clunky way. This isn't an issue that was even remotely present in Search for Reptar or Studio Tour, so I have no idea how they managed to mess it up. Once you're done sprinting around collecting garbage off the ground of this deserted theme park, you'll encounter a monorail. This takes you to 4 other sections of the park: Golf Park, Princess Theatre, Reptar Island, and Ooey Gooey World. This is where the gameplay really kicks off as you find yourself diving into more minigames, baby! Yes, that's right, we've got yet another minigame collection. What a super unique and innovative idea for a Rugrats game. Each area of the park features at least one minigame, including the main entrance area, which I initially didn't realise. Wandering around Euro Reptar Land can be extremely disorienting, which is similar to being in a giant theme park for the first time in real life, so points for unintentional accuracy there. Just playing these minigames will reward you with some more red tickets, but successfully completing them will hand you those coveted gold tickets. So we can all agree that we're sick to death of Rugrats minigame collections, right? Well, on the bright side, I guess since we have a new developer in charge, we might get some fresh minigame ideas. Nope, we're playing mini golf for the third time. Are you kidding me? By the time this game was released, there were 3 Mario Party games, featuring dozens and dozens of unique minigames. The smart thing to do would be to literally just copy some of these, but for some reason Avalanche Software don't, instead choosing to copy minigames already featured in the Rugrats series. The most offensive thing about this is that the copied minigames are worse than what we've already played. Take mini golf for example. It might seem minor, but they've removed the par number from the screen, now forcing players to press a button and bring up an entire scorecard to see whether you're meeting the goal for the current hole. Additionally, the helpful shot indicator is completely removed and the power meter is 1,000,000 times more clunky. Then you've got cool moments like the camera obscuring your view, resulting in you taking blind shots alongside just generally awful ball physics. At one point the ball was straight up refusing to go in the hole, even though I was hitting it with reasonable enough power. The ball was constantly flinging out, and this one hole actually resulted in me losing the whole thing by a single stroke. It took damn near 30 minutes to play through these 9 holes, and I had zero desire to repeat that again. Circling back to the main entrance, the minigame here is literally just the same game as Milk Squirt in Studio Tour. Then, in the Japanese themed area, there's another shooting gallery style game. Not only did they copy a minigame from a previous Rugrats game, but they also copied themselves. Continuing on through the park, you'll find a minigame that's literally just the Lunar Lander game from Studio Tour as well, rounding out the collection of minigames repeated here. The other so-called unique minigames here are all god-awful. There's Chucky Chan, where Chucky gets to fight defenseless planks of wood. Seriously, all you do here is kick the shit out of pieces of wood that don't put in any effort to fight back. Well, at least Chucky gets to take out his dead mum angst in a safe way. There's also a bumper car game which had the highest chance of being enjoyable, but it's the complete opposite. There are 3 variations of this. In one of them you have to drive around and collect balloons, trying not to get hit as this will make you lose balloons. This particular game sucks because of how random losing balloons is. Sometimes I'll drive into somebody and their balloons will go flying, but other times I'll do the exact same thing, but I'll be penalised for it. It's just too random and frustrating. There's nothing like having 20 plus more balloons than all of the other competitors, only to have your entire score wiped in under 5 seconds.
Hello darkness, my old friend.
The other variations include a mode where you boringly shoot hockey pucks at enemies, and a knockoff of the Spyro ice hockey game. None of these are fun, and this silly Frenchman kept saying this line over and over again.
At least I know the alphabet, I think. At least I know the alphabet, I think.
At least I know the alphabet, I think. At least I know the alphabet, I think. At least I know the alphabet, I think. At least I know the alphabet, I think. At least I know the alphabet, I think. At least I know the alphabet, I think. At least I know the alphabet, I think. At least I know the alphabet, I think.
The other couple of games are really scraping the bottom of the barrel. These are Whack-A-Mole and Skee-Ball. Way to really think outside of the box, guys. Once you've played through all of the mini-games, you still won't have enough gold tickets to move on, meaning you'll have to purchase some of the items at the gift shop I mentioned at the start of the review. Unfortunately, it seems some of these items don't result in gold tickets, which means you've wasted your red tickets for nothing. The first item I bought was this telescope thing. I went to the spot on the ground with the corresponding image, selected the item, and was rewarded with a picture of Kimmy. As far as I could tell, all this item did was allow me to view half a dozen images. Glad I wasted a bunch of tickets on this. A lot of the minigames are ridiculously hard for a kids game on the medium setting, and none of them were fun enough for me to want to try again after losing. Additionally, I had zero interest in grinding red tickets so I could buy up more items. Nothing in this game even remotely can motivate you to do all that menial work. Getting 16 gold tickets takes you to the Reptar v Robo-Snail fight as a finale, but I guess I'll never experience that. I think the one saving grace for Rugrats in Paris is the visuals. The in-game graphics are really solid, especially when up-res to HD textures. The cutscenes utilise a bit of a different art style compared to what's been previously seen, but I think their models are actually really good for a PS1 game. This game gave me early PS2 game vibes, so I'm surprised it wasn't on that console. The PS2 released on October 26, 2000, 3 days before this game launched on PS1. It seems insane to me that they didn't push it onto that console. There were only 22 PS2 games available at launch, with most of them being god-awful. Not only would Rugrats in Paris have fit in with that lineup, but I'm sure it would have sold like crazy there. So yeah, I absolutely hated my time with Rugrats in Paris on the PS1. It's just a clunkier, more uninspired version of the Rugrats games that have come before it. This game is like when you cheat on a test by getting the answers beforehand, but getting 100% on the test would make it too obvious you cheated, so you deliberately get a few answers wrong. In Avalanche Software's case, it's like they took these answers that Studio Tour and Search for Reptar had already provided on how to make a successful game in this style, translated them to Mandarin and back to English again via Google Translate, and then wrote those answers down. In some ways, Rugrats in Paris resembles those games, but it's an awful bastardization of it overall. Maybe the handheld version will be better.
I ride lots of rides too! Yeah! And eat lots of...
There is quite literally nothing here worth seeing. I just don't understand how we ended up with these. Avalanche Software literally had 2 good games to base their console version on, yet somehow managed to make an abomination. After thoroughly enjoying its predecessors, Rugrats in Paris is a huge disappointment. Straight to F. Another day, another Rugrats 2D platformer on Game Boy. Software Creations are taking another crack at getting a Rugrats handheld game to work well. Their previous games are notable for being gorgeous to look at, but awful in the gameplay department. Booting up the handheld version of Rugrats in Paris causes a bit of initial confusion. I'm not immediately platforming, and instead I'm in this kind of ugly overworld. I assumed this was like a Mario Bros style overworld, but the first thing I clicked on took me to more damn minigames. Some of these are 2D versions of stuff seen in the console game, while other games are completely new. At least Software Creations have the ability to come up with some new ideas. The way this game works is that you earn tickets doing those mini-games, which you can then spend on entering the side-scrolling levels. These levels are each really unique on the surface, but in reality they're all just the same thing. Sure, there's one level where Dill's flying a plane, or Tommy is apparently riding around on the Scooby-Doo Spooky Coaster from Movie World on the Gold Coast, but it's all the same. Every level, much like their previous 2 handheld games, is all about you checking off some boxes before heading to the exit. It's always take X number of photos and head to the exit, or find X number of people before heading to the exit. I do appreciate that they varied the gameplay a whole lot more here than previously, but when there's been 2 whole games where the core gameplay is identical, well, no amount of fancy window dressing can compensate. It's especially hard when the actual platforming is clunky and stiff. How have they not even tried to address this major problem with their games? On the plus side, the visuals are still pretty good. The excitement of seeing a licensed game look stunning has mostly worn off by now, but I have to give them credit where credit is due. Overall, I'd say this is the worst of the handheld Rugrats games so far. At best, the gameplay is downright boring. At worst, the gameplay is downright terrible. The platforming is awful, the minigames aren't fun, the objective of every level is identical to their previous 2 games. The whole package is just so unappealing. Software Creations are seemingly refusing to address any of the major, fundamental issues with their platformers. Playing these games genuinely made me angry. Please, don't put yourself through the same experience. Just like its console sibling, Rugrats in Paris on Game Boy Color sucks. F tier as well. New console, but same developer. Will Castle Capers finally shake things up? There's some form of a story in Castle Capers, but all you really need to know is that it's one of those Rugrats adventures where they're playing make-believe while trying to get back some things Angelica stole. The make-believe angle is so perfect for every Rugrats game because it basically means you have free reign on coming up with level ideas and you don't have to commit to a singular theme. According to a couple of wikis I looked at, the setup for this game is actually quite similar to the console game Royal Ransom, which would release the following year. Players have 6 levels to traverse through and also get the luxury of choosing which baby they want to play as. I was really surprised that Dill was one of the options, so naturally I selected him. Cruising around in his little baby vehicle thing was a great way to experience this game. As you know, Castle Capers is another 2D platformer. Anybody who's played any of Software Creation's other Rugrats titles is going to be pretty familiar with what's going on here. The formula has been tweaked a little though. Previous games have asked players to collect specific items before they can exit the level, but here you're basically just platforming from a start point to an end point. The little bit of story before each level always mentions an item you need to get back, but don't worry about scouring levels to find these. Those items essentially act as the end goal and are impossible to miss. Before you can get to that end goal, you will have to best Angelica in a boss battle first. This happens in every level and they all suck. They pretty much just boil down to the player being asked to avoid Angelica's attacks for a minute or two, and then the item you need just appears. It'll change slightly a couple of times where you'll have to dispatch a few waves of minions, but it's incredibly dull and the game could really have done with eliminating these boss battles entirely and just focused on platforming. While not a requirement, you will see a bunch of items scattered across each level. Every time you grab one, the counter in the bottom corner will go down, with the goal being to hit 0 before finishing the level. As far as I could tell, these only contribute to your overall score for the game, alongside a few other factors like discovering secret areas in levels. A much more interesting discovery is the other babies that are found throughout levels. Each level has a set of 2 babies you'll find and recruit on your journey. The entire purpose is to give you a boost when it comes to jumping. Pressing up on the D-pad will set your character on their shoulders, giving you greater range on your leap. I'm not entirely sure whether finding at least one of these characters is compulsory to complete the levels though. I heavily use these abilities, but I don't think I can recall any specific moments where it would have been 100% impossible to continue without their assistance. Strangely though, there's an Arabian Nights themed level where you're flying on a magic carpet.
Point of view.
You don't do any jumping here, and as far as I can tell, the babies you recruit can't actually contribute to anything. Seems like a bit of an oversight there. One of my consistent complaints about Software Creation's Rugrats games is that the babies are so helpless. They never have any attacks or ways to defend yourself, and it usually makes the games tedious and a little dull because all you're doing is jumping. Castle Capers kind of addresses this, but in a not very well executed way. Each level you have a themed item that can be thrown out. This is usually some type of food which will distract the enemies for a brief moment. Unfortunately, this is a bit clunky and not really a reliable defense. It's better to once again focus on platforming as your way to stay safe. Health has also seen a bit of a change up due to the tweaked format. Previously, you'd be collecting a set amount of items and every bit of damage you'd take would set you back an item or two. Because the collectathon aspect is completely gone, at least from a compulsory standpoint, Software Creations had to come up with something different. Essentially, you have a set amount of hit points in the top left corner. Taking damage will send this towards 0, and collecting health pickups will restore it slightly. This is a fine system, and I found it worked rather well with the gameplay. Much better than previously, in my opinion. But then the devs go and completely screw it up by adding one of the most idiotic things I have ever seen. Your health here carries over from level to level. On the surface, this doesn't seem too bad. Mario, who is the gold standard for 2D platformers, features this exact same sort of system. However, the big difference is that when you die in 2D Mario games, you just restart the level. Castle Capers is operating on a password system, meaning you have to throw in a password if you fail. My initial reaction was that after every level, if my health was low, I could just die and then use the password to start back up with full health. Well, that's not possible. The password system saves the exact amount of health you have upon beating a level. This means you're essentially having to beat the game with one life. Your health follows you everywhere no matter what. Health pickups are pretty scarce too. It was rare that I'd find more than one in a level and they'd only do like a 10-point increase. It's just insane. I ended up using a GameShark code to tweak the design of the game and make it far less ridiculous. Doing this allowed me to start each level with some actual goddamn health, which is how it really should have been in the first place. I feel like Software Creations did this as a way to give the game difficulty, but it's just dumb. As far as I can tell, if you finish a level with one hit point left, you're basically fucked and have to start the game from scratch. Platforming controls were another aspect of previous Rugrats platformers that were a bit of a miss. They weren't completely terrible, but felt quite stilted and slow. For the first time, Software Creations have overhauled the system and it now feels entirely different. It controls much more smoothly and fluid than in the past, but like the health system, they kind of messed this up. The devs swung way too far in the other way, making movement incredibly slippery and tough to control a lot of the time. To make things even more difficult, there's an ice-themed level which turns the slipping and sliding up to an 11. While it's a bit of a bummer to see them sort of miss the mark, the way the levels are designed actually makes this issue quite minor. Precision platforming, where you're making really tough jumps, isn't much of a thing in Castle Capers. By designing levels this way, the slippery controls are entirely manageable, and they won't cause that much of a headache for you. By far, this is the most enjoyable Rugrats platformer to control. Graphically, Castle Capers looks stunning, but I guess that's to be expected at this point. The team in charge of the visuals for Software Creations games were so damn good. They only lasted a couple more years after this game, so I really hope the crew landed on their feet. All of the environments are a joy to look at, and I was loving the increase in power the GBA provided. Their Game Boy Color games were great to look at right to the end, but by the time Rugrats in Paris rolled around, it was becoming a bit run-of-the-mill. They're able to inject even more detail into the levels, and it really looks like a next-gen Rugrats platformer. Seeing how skilled Software Creations were with Nintendo's handheld platformers, it's a little mind-boggling that they were in charge of the home console and PC versions of Nicktoons Racing, but the GBA release was handed off to a different dev. I would have loved to see what they could do with that game. Rugrats Castle Capers is the first time I can say I truly had fun with a Rugrats platformer. It goes without saying that this is the best of the bunch, and I'm honestly surprised that Software Creations improved this much. They basically reworked the formula of their games entirely for Castle Capers. With a handful of previous releases, it would have made a lot of sense to just churn out another Rugrats game in the exact same style. But instead, they overhauled the platforming, changed up the core gameplay a bit, and then they went ham with the visuals. I think I would call this game genuinely good. Heck, it comes pretty close to pushing into what I'd consider a great game, which is why it's so disappointing to see them mess up such a basic aspect. Never replenishing the player's health hurts the overall experience so much. The boring boss battles can be ignored and the slippery platforming doesn't have much of an impact. But the health? Yeah, that's a bridge too far. As long as you play it via emulator so you can rectify that one silly mistake, I would 100% recommend Rugrats Castle Capers. If you're looking for a Rugrats platformer, this is it. As long as you're playing Castle Capers via emulator, this is a definite A tier game. Could have been S tier if I didn't have to add that side note. I Gotta Go Party, a disgusting name for an equally disgusting game. Three words, minigame collection. Or maybe that's 2 words, I don't really know. The correct spelling of the term minigame is up for debate. Either way, we've got another one of these bastards to review. Here your gameplay options are pretty standard. You've got single player and multiplayer, a single player story, and then quick play and free play mode. Quick Play randomly chooses 10 different minigames for you to play through, while Free Play is exactly that. You're free to choose whatever game you want. Once you jump into the story mode, you'll find that the game is framed around hide and seek. You play as Tommy and have to find all of the other characters, except Susie Carmichael, who still appears on the end of game congratulations screen. Why is Susie always getting shafted? To find the babies, you'll be engaging in what is essentially a point and click game. You go around the various rooms of the Pickles house and spot the incredibly obvious hiding spots. Every time you click on a baby, you'll get a unique minigame, which I kind of have to give Eurocom props for. A lot of Nick minigame collections tend to repeat games. Each minigame requires you to hit a target score. Failing to reach it means you lose one of your 4 lives. This seems pretty tough on the surface, considering there are 24 minigames. In reality, you're never in any danger of failing on your hide and seek quest. Successfully beating minigames will restore your lives, and losing minigames itself doesn't see any negative consequences other than losing a single life. Anytime you lose a minigame, I Gotta Go Party just immediately brushes past it. You can't even try again if you want to. A game in this style lives and dies by the ideas and execution for the minigames. Rather than being an enjoyable romp like Search for Reptar or Studio Tour, this is such a bore. All of the gameplay in I Gotta Go Party is low effort, unimaginative, and unenjoyable to play. I don't think I experienced a single second of fun. This game was so bad that I'm just completely unenthusiastic while making this video. It's not a crazy, broken abomination that makes for a fun review. It's just this dull as fuck collection of games that wouldn't even be worth playing on a flash site. There are some sort of unique game ideas at times. One example is where you have to feed Spike. The surface level idea of these kinds of games spark interest, but the execution is so low effort. In this game, you have to make Spike either eat or drink, but this basically boils down to you mashing the D-pad to eat when prompted, and then pressing the A button to drink when prompted. Stuff like this barely counts as gameplay. When you can turn your brain off completely and breeze through everything, that's when you know a game is completely worthless. There's a minigame where you dig up bones that is essentially a baby version of Minesweeper, and a game where you have to dig up the most sand, which almost invokes the kind of feelings and style you'd see from a Mario Party minigame. But everything else is just basic and boring minigame ideas that have been beaten to death, or things that barely even count as gameplay. So many times I'd find a baby and end up playing through something ripped straight out of those 90s educational CD-ROM games.
Tim's got a cold.
There are multiple memory games, one game that's literally just doing a jigsaw puzzle, a game where you have to spot the odd image out that cycles through the same few images over and over, and a game where you have to sort toys into the correct toy box. The jigsaw puzzle, as well as the game where you have a puzzle that you need to unscramble, are quite hard to complete because of the strict time limit imposed on those games. In fact, in the case of the unscrambling one, I'd argue it's close to impossible to properly solve before you run out of time. The weird thing about I Gotta Go Party is that none of this matters. Like I said, failing doesn't have any real consequences, and then success or failure in games like these is decided so randomly. You'd imagine it would be pretty simple here. Did the player solve the puzzle? If yes, they won. Instead, it's based on how many pieces you put in the correct slot. So many games in I Gotta Go Party are like this. It honestly feels a little insulting. And I'm not joking even slightly when I say there are multiple games where you can just not touch the controls and still win. The best example is one of the sections which is very similar to the on-rails vehicle parts of the Rugrats 2D platformers. Here you need to collect 30 bottles as you float down a river, but so many of the bottles are just placed in your path that I could easily see somebody beating it without moving an inch. The only other minigame I'm even slightly motivated to talk about is the kart racer. Yes, this is another Nick title to include some form of kart racing. Impressively, this is probably the worst example of kart racing I've seen in my life. First off, the track and location you're racing on is straight up reused from an earlier game. Then you have the world's stiffest controls. Controlling your vehicle is so sluggish and immediately made me want to stop playing. Then you don't even have basic kart racer staples like items. There are like 2 speed boost things to drive over, but that's it. And to top it all off, the sound effect your kart makes after getting the speed boost is painful. despite featuring 24 minigames, you'll complete I Gotta Go Party story mode in around 45 minutes. And no, going back and playing individual games or playing with friends is not at all appealing here. Essentially what we have is a very shit recreation of the super successful Search for Reptar and Studio Tour games. Those games were not only successful from a sales point of view, but they were also really well made games. They're not incredible works of art or totally revolutionary, but they had decent minigames and had the benefit of being the first time we got to explore the most iconic location of the show, in Search for Reptar's case, and a very unique premise for Studio Tour. In I Gotta Go Party, none of that is present. You're back to exploring Tommy's house, but this time in the most basic way possible. It's like looking at a slideshow of different rooms of the house. There's no interactivity. Even if this was the first time the show's locations were presented in video game form, this would be a letdown. But considering Search for Reptar already exists, it's an even bigger failure. I think the one argument to defend I Gotta Go Party is that it is very clearly aimed at a very, very young audience, but I don't think even this stands up well to fight off the mountain of issues standing before it. Many of the minigames you see here feel like the type of stuff you'd see in the games released for the Leapstar. It's just bare bones games designed to get really young kids puzzle solving and learning key cognitive skills in a fun way. On one hand, targeting that audience is super unique. You don't often see games going for a demographic that young on genuine video game consoles. But there's a good reason for that. By the time somebody is old enough to play a proper video game system, they've well and truly aged out of this kind of experience. Not many parents are buying a GBA for a literal baby. And even if this was what Eurocom was aiming for, which I have my doubts on, it still fails at that. There are numerous insane difficulty spikes. You'll go from something like playing an extremely basic memory game to the scrambled puzzle I mentioned earlier, and it's like night and day. A toddler isn't going to be able to handle that. No, I don't believe Eurocom's goal with this game was to target some kind of underserved audience on the GBA. I think they saw this as an easy way to make a quick buck while investing as little time and money into it as possible. In 2002, Eurocom released James Bond 007 Nightfire, Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, and ported Crash Bandicoot The Wrath of Cortex to the GameCube. Just examine that for a second. They made a home console game based on James Bond, one of the biggest franchises in the world. They made a handheld game based on Harry Potter, one of the biggest franchises in the world. And they also ported a Crash Bandicoot game, which was still one of the most iconic video game franchises at the time. So is it much of a surprise to see their GBA Rugrats title become an afterthought? Sure, Rugrats was a juggernaut too, but when you weigh it against those other games they were working on, it sort of falls out of favour. In the following year, they'd develop a game based on Buffy and released one of their only original IP games, Sphinx and the Cursed Mummy, which was apparently in development for several years. I have no doubt in my mind this was purely a quick cash grab to get a little extra money flow for the studio. I can't imagine this game took long to make, and looking at the credits, they clearly invested very little into I Gotta Go Party. By my count, Eurocom dedicated just 10 employees to working on this game. Honestly, I'm surprised that many people were involved. I'm not sure how many people exactly were working at Eurocom at this point in time, but when the studio shut down they had 200 employees. Just a little perspective for how small and insignificant this release was for them in the scheme of things. Unsurprisingly, being an afterthought means production-wise this game is completely unremarkable. Some of the sprite work is okay at best, but there are times, like in the racing sections, where the graphics are ugly as sin. Maybe it stands out so much because we've seen gorgeous sprite work for previous Rugrats games, but the visuals for I Gotta Go Party are just another aspect lacking any spark. This genuinely is the least excited I have ever been to review a game, even less excited than the chess game Cartoon Network put out. I Gotta Go Party is so lifeless. The minigames are so basic and uninteresting, and they honestly left me with not a lot to talk about. The games aren't broken or glitchy, just boring as hell. Games like this aren't much fun to review. Clearly this was a D-level project for Eurocom. I would imagine anything with Rugrats slapped on the box was a license to print money in 2002, so they saw that, capitalized on it, and were probably able to fund a bunch of other projects they were more passionate about, despite only dedicating 10 workers to this game. It's just so obvious there was no passion from anybody involved here. There's no reason for anybody to ever play Rugrats I Gotta Go Party. There are plenty of other Rugrats minigame collections on the market that actually do exude excitement and passion for the show, and have genuinely fun gameplay to boot. I Gotta Go Party is a completely irredeemable game, so it's little surprise to find it in F tier. Rugrats finally stumbled onto the new gen of home consoles in 2002.
That's Queen Angelica to you! I rule the backyard now with my magic wand of power. And that means you dumb babies are my loyal suspects.
Once again, the babies have wild imaginations narrative has been employed to give us an interesting Rugrats game. However, this time things aren't entirely left up to their imagination. Stu has gone absolutely insane and built what can only be described as an abomination in the Pickles' backyard.
What's he building in there? What the hell is he building in there?
The neighbours have to be fuming over this monstrosity. Imagine waking up one day and a 100-foot tall castle is just staring down at you. So yeah, the kids have a legit castle to run around in addition to their overactive imaginations. Naturally, Angelica decides the castle is hers, so it's up to Tommy and co to kickstart another revolution by sending her oppressive ass to the guillotine. Initially, you start out playing as Kimmy, which is kind of a unique choice for the specific character to drop you in as. Pressing B at this herd of babies will change your character though, allowing you to choose any of the regular crew. There's no difference in playstyle or anything, so the choice purely comes down to whichever character is your favourite. Before even getting into the castle, the Pickles' backyard and house are explorable, but it feels a little off. Running inside the house, the layout is just so foreign. I don't remember Tommy's house ever looking like this. You'll quickly find yourself bored of this limited environment, so you head towards the castle, which apparently requires payment to get into. The coins you've seen scattered about are used for this. Whenever you fail a level, you're kicked back here, and you essentially have to pay 100 coins for another life. To teach the player about this and not make the mechanic too much of a pain initially, you're given 500 coins. This is a really weird and, need I say it, unnecessary addition to the game. All it really adds is the possibility of getting stuck. If you spend all your coins, you can't get back into the castle. To combat this, you can collect coins in the backyard, but depending on how many you have, there might not be enough. Getting around this results in you having to save, quit, and then re-enter, where the coins will have respawned. It's so unnecessary, and it's a real sign of things to come. Avalanche were obsessed with you collecting items to use as currency in this game. Alongside the coins, you'll also receive big batteries for beating levels. Once you collect enough of these, you gain access to new floors of the castle. Then on top of that, you'll find small batteries and dollar bills scattered around levels. This is unnecessarily confusing. Your coins are purely used for buying access to the castle, so the second form of money allows you to buy mini games that can be played with friends and stuff like that. It's a pretty superfluous addition, all things considered. After you've tried to wrap your head around all that, you'll find yourself actually playing the game, where it quickly becomes apparent that Avalanche took most of their inspiration from Nintendo 64 style 3D platformers. Levels are a mix of 3D platforming, vehicle and race segments. It's all pretty stock standard stuff for any player that has picked up one of these kind of games before. The wheel definitely hasn't been reinvented here for the gameplay. While the inspiration is clear, Avalanche attempted to put their own spin on the structure of these games, and the final result is one of the most awkwardly put together games I've had the displeasure of playing. I mentioned the small batteries found in levels. What do these do? Well, for the first 30 minutes or so, I had no clue whatsoever. You'll discover their use with a massive thud soon enough. Collecting these is mandatory to progress. Every single level in Royal Ransom has a battery price tag you need to pay. Some sort of explanation of this would have been welcome. It's so easy to brush the batteries off as unimportant when the dollar bills aren't crucial. Knowing that I need to collect small batteries should be laid out before you even start. Gatekeeping certain areas behind some sort of requirement is pretty normal in these style of games. In Mario 64, you're forced to have a certain amount of stars if you want to progress deeper into Peach's castle. Royal Ransom copies that, with players needing to win big batteries to unlock new floors of the castle, but then they take it a step too far and apply the same logic to individual levels. The individual levels are this game's equivalent to the specific stars in Mario 64's courses. Imagine how clunky that game would be if every time you wanted to attempt a new star, you had to pay some sort of price. It's just nuts. All it results in is an inevitable wall for the player to hit that can only be knocked down by grinding levels you've already played. It doesn't help that the game is so stingy with batteries. You'll be able to collect 4 batteries at most in a level, with most levels only having like 2 or 3. These batteries don't respawn either, and they're hidden pretty well in most levels rather than handed to you. When you take all of this into account and the fact that every single level in the game costs multiple batteries to enter, it just becomes a slog. To use as few batteries as possible, I started only playing the levels with the smallest requirement. This meant I was only playing the levels with a 2 battery asking price, and eventually a 3 battery asking price when I progressed deeper into the game. Then we arrive at the next awkward bit of structuring from Avalanche. I unlocked access to the final level after playing what felt like only half the levels. It is genuinely bizarre to be able to waltz up to the final level and beat the game while simultaneously being told, no, you haven't earned the right to enter Chucky's Dinosaur Fuckfest.
What did he say?
It's like they saw games where you only needed to meet a minimum threshold to reach the final boss and were inspired to do something similar, but the game they were making didn't really jive with that design idea. This is definitely worsened because of the small battery nonsense. I'd imagine if I was spending more batteries on the levels asking for 3 or more, I would have covered more ground before getting to the end. "3D platforming is the most consistent style of gameplay thrown at you in Royal Ransom. Most of the time you'll be doing multiple different challenges in the same environment in the vein of those Nintendo 64 platformers, and sometimes even the racing sections would be lumped into that environment too. The platforming controls are okay. Running and jumping feels solid in most situations, but it also feels like the game just doesn't recognize your inputs a lot of the time, particularly when it comes to double jumping. Controlling the camera is a pain too. 3D platformers struggled with this majorly at first, but Royal Ransom is next level. The camera won't automatically jump into the worst spot as much as some other games from around this time, but when it does, it's such a pain to get it back into a half-decent viewing angle. Pretty much everything you do while platforming is guided by a glowing orb of light. There's no real need to think when the orb is telling you what to do. Despite all the criticisms I've thrown at Royal Ransom so far, I have to admit I regularly found myself slipping into a groove where I was kinda digging it, but every time I was abruptly pulled out of that groove without fail, generally because of another one of Avalanche's crazy design decisions. A good example of this is in the previously mentioned Chucky's Dinosaur Fuckfest. Level's pretty simple. Bones are scattered around a big level and you need to ride a dinosaur to retrieve them and place them back at a pile. Instead of just accepting the returned bones when you step on the pile or something similar that makes sense, Royal Ransom asks you to stand back and spit the bone into the pile. Barely missed the pile? Too bad, you've failed, you're a worthless piece of shit and your family has disowned you. It's just a needlessly clunky layer added on top of what could have been a fun level. Zooming around with the dinosaur was actually pretty cool. Basically every platforming level has something like this. They get 99% of the way towards putting together a fun level, then shoot themselves in the foot. I'd almost rather the game be a broken mess like the time I glitched under this hippo, instead of coming so close to being fun. When you're not participating in frustrating platforming levels, you'll be participating in frustrating vehicle sections and races. I'm not exaggerating when I say every one of these is awful. Well, I guess the snow race and the magic carpet ride are passable, but the rest are horrid. The boat race was the very first thing I played in the game and it made me come so close to turning it all off. Controls are ridiculously loose here and they really cheaped out on the level. There's one track that you race 3 times. The only change up is that you go through the track backwards in your second race. Flying this plane around in the circus area hurt my soul. Your objective is to shoot all of these clowns, but the plane controls sloppily, and the aiming of your shots is unbelievably bad to the point where you're forced to be an inch away just to land anything. The submarine section has such a clunky control scheme that was breaking my brain. Avalanche went for a quirky setup where pressing up and down will change how deep in the water you are, while also having a separate accelerate button that will fling you forwards. Your goal is to pick up a few treasure chests and drop them in a net, with plenty of enemies and hazards placed in your path. In the end, none of that actually matters because this level completely overlooks the fact that I can rise straight up to the surface where there are no hazards. The very last level is a vehicle section too. You storm Angelica's castle with a catapult that you drive around. On paper it sounds like a pretty epic way to end the game, but it's a massive dud. All it consists of is driving onto pressure plates, which lower a gate and allows you to shoot down a door. You do this a handful of times and then the game just ends. I didn't have a shootout with Angelica or get to see a cutscene where I had thwarted her. It just cut to it all being over, to my supreme disappointment. It should be noted that while the game holds your hand in terms of where to go in the platforming levels, there are some absurd difficulty spikes at times. For a game aimed at kids, it's brutally unforgiving, but I don't think it's deliberate. A lot of my setbacks in this game regularly came back to jankiness, awkward design, or occasionally glitches. When you combine this with the roadblocks regularly put up due to the whole battery fiasco, you've got a whole lot of frustration simmering here. Graphically, Royal Ransom is a mixed bag, like pretty much every other aspect. The game is bookended by 2 meaty cutscenes, but those are the only cutscenes you get for the entire game. As you're storming the castle, it's just level after level after level. The cutscenes also have this weird border, and I cannot for the life of me figure out why it's there. It can't have been because the devs thought it looked good, because it's super ugly. I'm thinking it had something to do with the performance side of things. And while I love that they went in depth with the 2 cutscenes we get, the visual style they use here is radically different to what we've seen in cutscenes previously. I found that the Rugrats home console games have done a great job at recreating such a weird 2D art style in 3D. Here they depart from that style and it's not for the better. Characters almost look like they're claymation and have strange rubberiness and fluidity to them. I really dislike this look. When you jump into the gameplay, the models look a lot like the models from Avalanche's Rugrats in Paris game that released a couple years earlier. It really wouldn't surprise me if they were reused. It's not a bad thing though, because I think those models look pretty good. When you take into account the environments and the scope of some of the levels, I'd say Royal Ransom is the best looking home console Nick game of this era so far. Boy Genius, Revenge of the Flying Dutchman and Beach Bandits were all similar sort of games to this, but all look significantly worse. The presentation aspect I disliked the most was the overabundance of inane chatter from the characters. These babies do not shut up.
You babies are gonna be cream pie.
I've often cited the lack of voice acting in games I've reviewed, or been mercilessly attacked for not bringing it up in the case of Nick Kart Racers 2, but if this is the alternative, I'll gladly have all of the characters be mute. Put this game down for 5 seconds in the hub world and you'll have Susie, who is the game's narrator / guide, Angelica, and whichever baby you've selected, all yelling over each other. I almost would have preferred the game to play out to the sounds of an actual baby crying.
I gotta get me some new babies. These ones are getting too smarty pants for my own good.
I've been really harsh on Rugrats Royal Ransom, and for good reason. This really isn't a good game. The frustrating thing is, the aspects that make Royal Ransom a bad game can easily be removed or fixed. The awkward construction and lack of cohesion for the game's structure account for the overwhelming majority of issues. I can very easily see an alternate reality where I look back on this as a fun little Rugrats themed love letter to 3D platformers on the Nintendo 64. Instead, by the end of it, I was just done. I didn't even have the slightest bit of motivation to seek out the levels I skipped over, mostly because it would have meant I'd need to grind batteries to access them, despite literally beating the game.
Royal Ransom had so much potential, so it's a bit disappointing to have to put it into C tier. The last OG Rugrats game might also be the worst.
Rugrats Go Wild is broken into two different sections. The first you'll experience is the top-down overworld. Sort of following the film's narrative, the Rugrats babies wash up on this island, which serves as the backdrop for your time with the game. Immediately you'll be controlling Tommy, sort of aimlessly wandering around, picking up pink and blue goo. The pink goo is actually ammo for an attack you can use in some levels, while the blue stuff is your health. Bizarrely, both of these constantly respawn, so you can infinitely farm the stuff. The only real action you can perform while in the top-down mode is walking around. Thankfully, you can also run by pressing B, a welcome addition that makes exploring relatively painless. Quickly you realise the overworld exists purely to make you do fetch quests. Tommy will constantly be asked to find some sort of item, and after retrieving it you'll jump into actual gameplay. There's two types of gameplay here. In the first level you'll get a taste of the side-scrolling action segments, for lack of a better term. I don't even know what the right term would be to describe this. Essentially, you're platforming on just a single screen with your objective centered on killing a specific number of enemies to succeed. Your initial experience with this is fighting off monkeys while jumping around jungle-themed platforms. Just like in the overworld, the ammo and health pickups infinitely respawn, so you shouldn't have too much trouble. Dispatching all of the monkeys brings on an epic boss showdown with a gorilla. Thanks to the infinitely respawning health and ammo pickups, you're free to just stand right in front of the boss and pelt him with goop until he dies. The next time you experience this level, it's the exact same thing, only you're fighting alligators instead of monkeys. And it isn't just the gameplay that's the same, the environment used is practically identical. Not even bothering to give the second level a new coat of paint is pretty telling in regards to Go Wild's quality. Eventually they do change it up a decent amount for your third outing. You're randomly given control of Eliza here and you head underwater. Naturally, this changes the dynamics as you're no longer platforming, instead you're driving a submarine type vehicle. The goal here is the same though, kill sharks and eels until the game says it's time for a boss battle. The final time we see this type of gameplay is actually the finale of this whole experience. We have to save Nigel, who's being attacked by crabs. Again, we're tasked with killing a certain number of enemies, but to Imagine Engine's credit, there's an extra wrinkle here. The crabs are tossing around sand which will chip away at Nigel's health bar. If he hits 0, it's game over. Needless to say, this kind of platforming/combat gameplay is never anything close to good. It's ridiculously basic, pathetically easy, and always overstays its welcome. It's not the worst thing I've ever played though, to be perfectly honest. I would probably be a little bit more positive about this if the first and second levels weren't practically identical. The last two levels offer enough alterations to the formula to keep you engaged, so if they had found a twist for the alligator level, that would have been nice. Wouldn't have drastically altered my opinion, but it's better than just a copy-paste job. It's also really strange that the game places such a strong emphasis on attacking animals. Seeing Eliza wail on marine animals in her level is just a jarring sight to see. Where this type of gameplay really stinks is in the movement controls. Somehow it feels both sluggish and stiff while also being slippery. The majority of the time it feels like you're lugging around a Mack truck, but then at incredibly random moments it'll become all loose and you'll see your character flung across the screen to their death. It's a contradiction on paper, but Rugrats Go Wild manages to check both boxes at each end of the spectrum when it comes to awful platforming controls. The second style of gameplay actually had a whole lot of potential to be really fun, but ends up being the less enjoyable of the styles on show. It combines racing, action, and chase segments into one package. For example, the very first time you experience this, Tommy is tasked with catching a cub for some reason. Still not really sure why he was doing this, because the game's excuse for it is almost non-existent. This means you start off racing around a little track trying to catch up to the cub. Once you stop it, you quickly find that an angry mother is breathing down your neck, flipping the level into a chase segment where you have to outlast your pursuer for a set amount of time. Look, it's not groundbreaking or anything, but at a glance this seemed like a solid idea. These segments would have been great fun if the driving controls weren't arguably the worst of any video game ever made. To drive any of the vehicles you get control of in Go Wild, you need to hold down the D-pad the entire time. If you take your finger off and then try to resume control, the vehicle has a panic attack and all of a sudden you've done a 360 pop shove it. You'll hold down the directional button for which way you want to go, and then you'll have to slide your finger across to another button depending on which way you want to turn. It's the most bizarre racing controls I've ever experienced. It feels horrendous to play. My thumbs actually kind of hurt by the end of it all from constantly mashing down the D-pad. Imagine Engine do a good job of spicing up the different levels using this style of gameplay, even if it's mostly a new coat of paint, but frustratingly the fundamentals are too poor to enjoy it. These slight tweaks usually brought some more bizarre speed bumps too though. In Eliza's tubing level, your goal is to collect a number of items. However, because it takes the design idea from the first level where you're constantly looping around a small track, they have to repeatedly respawn the items. It just creates a really weird feel about the gameplay. It all feels so cheap. The Convy level is pretty much the same thing too, although this time you have to contend with a bunch of other cars randomly racing around that can steal the items out from under you. There was potential with the basic idea here, but Imagine Engine really missed the mark after they fleshed the idea out. Rugrats Go Wild is a constant loop. You go do a fetch quest on the island, completing this takes you to a level, you participate in one of two types of gameplay, then you rinse and repeat. The game doesn't do a great job of drawing you in with a retelling of the film either. It feels like the game very quickly abandons the idea of any narrative drive whatsoever, instead just having the player randomly stumble from NPC to NPC to do seemingly unrelated levels. It all just ends with you throwing goop at some crabs in what is essentially the exact same level as the one you kickstarted the game with. There's no sense of purpose to anything. Emphasizing this is the fact that later in the game you can end up doing levels out of order apparently. I stumbled upon Debbie at the Convy, which launched me into the Convy level. Beating this gave me nothing, so I just sort of awkwardly moved on. Then later on I discovered Nigel, who wanted me to bring him a camera. Bit of a weird request to give to a baby, but sure. Where can I find a camera, Nigel? To the absolute thrill of me, he instructed that I should go back and see Debbie, where I was forced to do that level again. The icing on the cake of Rugrats Go Wild is just how basic it feels in every single aspect. It's also bare bones that it comes across as a project that could have easily been home on the Game Boy Color. There's just so many little things, like the fact that dying sees you respawn with the minimum health possible. You could immediately chalk this down to being the game's way of punishing the player for dying, but that's contradicted by the fact that the game also respawns a bunch of health pickups right next to you. And then you also just have the fact that health pickups infinitely respawn in the overworld too. It makes no sense and it's so unnecessary. Visually, the game is unsurprisingly lackluster. The in-game visuals are nothing notable, and you get two tiny little cutscene type things at the beginning and end of the game depicting moments from the film. Rugrats Go Wild underwhelms on pretty much every level. What can I say? Rugrats Go Wild is yet another uninspired handheld cash-in for a Nickelodeon theatrical film. It's easily one of the worst games I have ever played, and I genuinely didn't enjoy a single second of it. There are one or two tiny idea nuggets here that could have been expanded on to provide a little bit of enjoyment, but outside of that, it's incredibly dire. Rugrats Go Wild goes straight into F tier. We're building up a nice little group here. All Grown Up was a down-to-earth show, but Express Yourself somehow manages to be the most insane Rugrats game. The setup for previous Rugrats games have been kinda wild, really playing to the babies can be so imaginative premise heavily. You've got Stu building a literal castle in the backyard, time travel, and Angelica's fantasy world of fashion. So where did Eltron decide to go with a much more down-to-earth show? Minigame compilation and boring fetch quests, baby. You hate to see it. Express Yourself puts players in the shoes of Angelica. Now, I might need some bigger fans of All Grown Up to correct me here, but as far as my research has turned up, Angelica is interested in working for the school newspaper for just a single episode. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems Eltron has taken that one literal B-plot of an episode about Angelica becoming a journalist, and that's where the crux of this game comes from. I looked through every plot summary and couldn't find another mention of her working for the newspaper, but judging it from this game, it would seem like Angelica's life goal was to be a journalist. You might not know this, but I actually got a degree in journalism, and it was all because I wanted to dig up hard-hitting scoops like Susie Sings, Dance Party to be Held, and Phil and Lil back together. That's got some serious Roll Tide vibes there. The game is broken up into 8 different missions, each of which focuses on Angelica chasing down a story. This is kind of fun because all of the stories are ripped straight from the actual show. Story mode boils down to Angelica needing to interview other characters, being sent on never-ending fetch quests, and periodically playing minigames that often don't make any narrative sense. If you think that sounds miserable, then you'd be correct, but let's begrudgingly take a deeper look at the gameplay, shall we? The investigative reporting section of the gameplay is doing most of the heavy lifting here. Side-scrolling around locations and trespassing in people's houses to find a specific person to talk to is the name of the game here 90% of the time.
Excuse me, what the actual fuck are you doing in my house?
You really just sprint around town trying to find people. The game allows Angelica to jump, which seems to be here purely for the sake of like 2 specific locations you barely ever go to. This style of game can work, but it relies on the game's locations having lots of life. Express Yourself peppers in so many NPCs, but the big issue is that they're kind of pointless. They might as well be part of the backgrounds. Characters are only allowed to talk when they're the object of Angelica's investigation. If they aren't your current objective, they stand there pointlessly. The potential was there for characters to have funny lines and even act as a sort of waypoint guiding you to your goal, but instead they wander around like mindless drones. When characters do talk, they're liable to blurt out some truly insane lines. It's not Jimmy Negatron levels of broken English. With the way this is written, I assume a native English speaker was in charge here, but a lot of it feels very unnatural for the characters and the show in general. Express Yourself gives you 3 different hubs to explore, all based on locations fans would have seen in the show. There's the suburban area where the kids' houses are, as well as the weird forest area. You've got the school area where the school is, and then there's the downtown city area with places like the Java Lava, or the museum where Tommy was an asshole to Grandpa Lou. For the first 50% of the game or so, you're restricted to travelling between just 2 locations per mission, then in the back half they let you loose in all 3. This is a double-edged sword, so the first half of the game can be a bit boring because you're stomping across the same locations constantly. You pretty much only use the suburban and school areas. I think Altron realised this would be repetitive, which is why they held the downtown area back for the second half to inject some life into the final stretch of the game. And while allowing players to travel across 3 different hubs does give your eyes some variety, it compounds a big issue in Express Yourself. So much of this game is just you wandering around aimlessly. Majority of the time, Express Yourself doesn't hint at where the next character you have to speak to is located. The only solution in these scenarios is to make an educated guess as to where that character would be. If that fails, it's time to comb through literally every inch of the game. When characters aren't the focus of the story, you can often find them always in the same spot. For example, Kimmy was pretty commonly found in this classroom. And if you ever need Grandpa Lou, you can always find him loitering suspiciously around these 2 girls who seem to be huddling away from him in fear. Maybe Tommy was right to be an asshole to him. Checking those locations out is often a good way to avoid the dreadful slog of searching the game's entire map, but this will often fail you. Having a vague familiarity with some of the episodes recreated here, I was able to use my knowledge of how they played out in order to find some of the characters quicker. I think this might have been Altron's intent, but it's very clumsy. Like, why does the climax of the mission where Chucky was pretending to be Chongo to impress a girl take place in a warehouse? This game just boils down to being Fetch Quest the video game. If you've seen my review of Code Lyoko Get Ready to Virtualize, this whole game is pretty much built around the boring normal world sections of that Code Lyoko game. One of the strangest running themes of Express Yourself is NPCs being obsessed with volleyballs, and no, this isn't meant to be a joke by the developers here. At least once per mission, Angelica will interview a character who will tell her that they're not speaking a word to her until she brings them a volleyball. You then proceed to find one laying around randomly for no reason, return it, and then you proceed to play a minigame. I can't even begin to comprehend the thought process behind this. I can't even find a single mention or example of volleyball being played in All Grown Up. Googling the terms Rugrats All Grown Up Volleyball only results in this game popping up. Shuffling from character to character becomes boring after the first 30 minutes, and Altron doesn't really put in much effort to spice things up for the player. One of the only real examples is this dreadful section where you have to slowly guide Spike to the river. It's super fun and definitely not one of the most tedious things I've experienced in recent memory. The last notable thing about the journalism parts of Express Yourself is that you can take damage. Yes, I'm just as confused as you are. Despite offering the ability to jump, these sections aren't exactly about platforming or anything. Yet, as Angelica runs about town, she will constantly get knocked on her ass by all manner of things. I was in disbelief the first time I turned a corner and got absolutely cleaned up by some jerk on a skateboard. Spiders, rats, pocket sand, the game has no shortage of things trying to kill Angelica for some strange reason. The only interesting thing about this bizarre addition is that Angelica's health is represented by pieces of paper. You have 8 of these and a bunch of them go flying everywhere when you get hurt, simulating the experience of Angelica running around town holding her notes. It's kind of neat, but there is absolutely no reason for there to even be a health bar here. It purely exists to annoy the player. The other aspect of the gameplay is the minigames. In this sense, Express Yourself is sort of like a stealthy sequel to I Gotta Go Party. You stomp about different locations and then periodically get a minigame. Sometimes the minigames will tie into the story, but other times you'll break out into a completely random minigame for no reason. The volleyball games are obviously the worst offenders here. Seriously, what is with these characters and their volleyball obsession? Minigames range from okay to very basic to a dumpster fire. The worst of them is probably the game where Angelica has to follow a shady businesswoman and hide every time she turns around. The timing of this minigame is just so poor. On the better side of things, you get to dress Lil up in some truly heinous outfits as part of a different minigame.
It is so bad, I want to give you a 0, but that's not possible. So I give you a 1.
The other area of the game I've neglected to mention is really where Express Yourself goes all in on being a girl game. From everything I've described so far, Express Yourself doesn't seem specifically targeted at one gender or another. It seems like it's targeting all Rugrats fans. But booting the game up quickly shows you that this was obviously designed to be a girl-focused game, just like Angelica's other game back on the PS1 and Game Boy Color. Playing through the story mode will unlock accessory pieces, and in the extras menu you can dress up the characters. Not every character though, just the girls. This is kind of pointless and has no impact on the actual game. They should have at least had the accessories show up on the characters when you play through a mission. Otherwise, it's just a very bare bones version of somebody playing dress up with a doll without having the actual doll to play with. Then there's this whole weird section that is kind of set up like a PDA. It's like a low rent version of those password diaries or something. You've got a profile you can fill out and customize in a very mature manner, and then you can write a to-do list or take a quiz to find out which character from All Grown Up matches you. It honestly feels like this stuff was slapped on at the last minute to turn this into a girl game. When you actually play the game, nothing about it is even remotely gendered. Visually, Express Yourself is decent. The environments you walk around are pretty unremarkable, which no doubt contributes to the persistent feeling of boredom throughout the game. However, I really like the work on the character sprites. It's really well done. Rugrats had some shockingly great artwork throughout their GBA and Game Boy Color era platformers, so it's nice to see this game was able to recapture some of that spark as the Rugrats franchise was heading towards the grave, at least in terms of video games. And you can't tell me the opening riff of the theme for the forest area doesn't give off Sweet Home Alabama vibes.
Sweet Home Alabama, where the skies are so blue. Sweet Home Alabama, Lord, I'm coming home to you.
I think the idea of gendering video games is kind of dumb, and I'm glad that practice has pretty much died out, at least in the console space. But if you're going to treat girls like a whole other species when it comes to games, can we at least make the games not suck ass? Totally Angelica was not good, and this just takes the poor quality to a whole other level. There is literally no reason to play Express Yourself. It's boring and tedious, the minigames aren't fun, and the one saving grace is that the sprites are nice, but not even the best the franchise has seen. It's a shame that Rugrats' time in the video game space ended so poorly. It had its ups and downs, but there were more than a few really good games. Express Yourself might get insane at times, but it's not nearly crazy enough to save it from the F tier. Rugrats certainly has a very messy video game history. I'd say anything from C tier and above in my tier list is worth playing, which covers 5 of the series' 15 games, which honestly isn't terrible. There are a lot of other animated series that don't get close to having a third of their games worth playing. I think the most disappointing part of Rugrats' video game history is that so many of these games had a lot of potential that were never fully realized. Castle Capers and the Rugrats movie proved that you could make a good Rugrats 2D platformer, yet there were more bad 2D platformers across their history than good. Studio Tour and Search for Reptar laid a great foundation, and somehow Rugrats in Paris completely squandered this. It's pretty clear from my tier list that I have Castle Capers as my best Rugrats game of all time. As for the worst, that's a little harder to decide. I Gotta Go Party and Rugrats Go Wild are absolutely terrible, but my gut immediately jumps to Scavenger Hunt when I look at F tier. A Rugrats board game on the Nintendo 64 seems like it could be really cool, but Scavenger Hunt is somehow both boring as hell and completely nonsensical with how it plays out. It's also embarrassingly devoid of content. But when it comes to games like these, especially games that people played during their childhoods, opinions can range wildly. What's your best and worst Rugrats game? And do you agree with my tier list? Let me know in the comments below. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on future videos and live streams, including the next one where I'll be reviewing and ranking every single Nicktoons Unite game.